The light of consciousness. A rare, fragile spark in a vast and silent universe. For one man, preserving that spark isn't just an ambition, it is a rigorous mathematical obligation. Welcome to The Gravity Breaker, an exhaustive history of Elon Musk. What follows is an unyielding 238,000-word chronicle of absolute disruption. From the violent Darwinian playgrounds of apartheid-era South Africa to the razor-thin margins of bankruptcy in Silicon Valley, from the deafening roar of reusable rockets to the silent frontiers of space-based artificial intelligence. This text was compiled and synthesized to map, cross-reference, and organize the sprawling, multi-layered timeline of a global empire. This is an uncompromised, exhaustive examination of extreme risk, physics-based engineering, and the volatile human ego driving our transition into the future. The Pretoria Crucible in the Technocratic Seed, 1971 to 1988. Chapter 1. Technocracy Legacy. Joshua Haldeman's Ideological Blueprint. Highveld comes without warning. One moment, the sky above Pretoria sits flat and white, baked into submission by the January sun, and the next a wall of red dust rolls across the jacaranda-lined avenues like something biblical and irritated. Elon Musk, 7 years old and already the kind of child who read encyclopedias the way other children ate cereal, compulsively in great consuming gulps, stood at the window of the family's Waterkloof Ridge home and watched the storm approach with an expression his mother would later describe not as fear but as calculation. He was not, she recalled, the kind of boy who ran from things. He was the kind of boy who wanted to know, with a precision that unnerved adults, exactly how fast the thing was moving and precisely when it would arrive. It is tempting, in retrospect, to read everything into moments like this one. Biographers are always hunting the revealing gesture, the childhood scene that contains the whole future coiled inside it like a watch spring. But with Musk, the temptation is justified by the sheer consistency of the pattern. The boy studying the Highveld storm was doing in miniature, and in instinct, exactly what the man would spend his adult life doing on a civilizational scale, staring at an approaching catastrophe, estimating its trajectory, and deciding, with a coolness that unnerved everyone around him, not to flinch. To understand where that quality came from, one must travel backward, away from Pretoria, away from South Africa entirely, to the Canadian prairies in the 1930s, and to a man named Joshua Norman Haldeman, whose blood runs through Elon Musk's veins and whose ideas, it turns out, run through his worldview with an intimacy that no one fully appreciated until very recently. Haldeman was, by any conventional measure, an eccentric. A chiropractor by training, and a gadfly by disposition, he arrived at political radicalism not through the usual channels of class resentment or ideological fashion, but through a kind of engineering disgust, a deep, almost aesthetic revulsion at the inefficiency of democratic governance. He was, in the early 1930s, a prominent figure in the Technocracy movement, a North American political philosophy that attracted a strange coalition of engineers, scientists, and anti-establishment intellectuals who had watched the Great Depression unfold and concluded, with a logic that was internally coherent if ultimately impractical, that the fundamental problem with modern civilization was that it was being run by the wrong kind of people. Politicians, the technocrats argued, were structurally incapable of rational governance. They responded to incentives, votes, donors, tribal loyalties that had nothing to do with efficiency, nothing to do with optimization, nothing to do with the dispassionate application of scientific method to social problems. What society required, the movement insisted, was management by engineers, by experts who could read a system's inputs and outputs and redesign it accordingly, stripping away the accumulated barnacles of tradition and sentiment that kept democracies lurching from crisis to crisis. The Technocracy movement, founded in New York in 1932 by the engineer Howard Scott, attracted somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million adherents at its peak, a fact that tends to surprise modern readers who have forgotten how badly shaken Western liberal democracy was during the Depression years, how many intelligent people looked at the breadlines and the dust bowls and concluded that something more fundamental than a policy adjustment was required. Haldeman was among the movement's most energetic Canadian organizers, and he wore his convictions with the slightly combative pride of a man who has decided that most of his neighbors are fools. He was not, in the usual sense, a hateful man. But he was a certain kind of true believer, the kind who divides the world cleanly between those who understand how systems actually work and those who are content to be governed by myths and slogans. He was also, and this detail matters enormously, a man constitutionally incapable of staying in one place. When the Canadian government banned the Technocracy movement in 1940, citing wartime security concerns in a decision that smacked more of bureaucratic irritation than genuine threat assessment, Haldeman did not petition for redress. He did not organize a legal challenge. He looked at the situation, calculated his options, and decided to leave. This was the Haldeman method. When institutions fail you, exit them. When the system becomes the obstacle, find a new system or build one. In 1950, he packed his family into a single-engine plane and flew 30,000 miles from Canada to South Africa, a journey of almost incomprehensible ambition for the era, stopping across multiple continents with the cheerful recklessness of a man who regarded fuel range as a constraint to be respected, but danger as merely a cost of doing interesting things. He settled in Pretoria, and his daughter May grew up in the long shadow of his personality. Adventurous, anti-authoritarian, technically minded, and possessed of a certainty about her own judgment that was either inspiring or exhausting, depending on how close you were standing. It is here that the biographer must resist the easy line of pure inheritance, the notion that Elon Musk is simply Joshua Haldeman with better hardware and a larger stage. The truth is more textured. Musk never knew his grandfather with the intimacy that forges direct transmission. Haldeman died in a plane crash in 1974 when Elon was barely 3 years old. What Musk inherited was not the man, but the mythology, the stories told by May and by the family's wider culture about what the Haldemans were and what they did. In the Haldeman legend, as it circulated through the family, bureaucracy was not merely inconvenient but actively malign, a conspiracy of mediocrity against excellence. Experts who worked outside institutional structures were not fringe figures but visionaries. And the greatest sin a man could commit was not failure but timidity, the choice to stay inside the safe perimeter when the territory beyond it was where the real work waited. Musk absorbed this story during the precise developmental window, late childhood, early adolescence, when such stories tend to become load-bearing structures in a person's identity. He was, by the early 1980s in Pretoria, a child in acute need of exactly this kind of mythology. The external circumstances of his life were punishing in ways that would have broken a child with fewer internal resources. His parents, Errol and May, divorced when he was around 9 or 10 years old, and the dissolution was not clean or gentle. Musk chose, in an act of loyalty or stubbornness or both, to move in with his father, Errol, a decision he would later describe with a complexity that suggests he has never fully resolved his feelings about it, acknowledging that Errol was, in ways he has only hinted at publicly, a difficult man to be close to. The Musk household under Errol's stewardship was not warm. It was technically sophisticated. Errol was an engineer comfortable with machines and systems, but emotionally austere in the way that certain kinds of male-dominated technical households can be, where competence is respected and vulnerability is not quite safe. At school, the situation was, if anything, worse. Pretoria in the early 1980s was a city operating under the particular social pressures of late apartheid South Africa, a society that had calcified its cruelties into law, and was beginning, though it could not yet fully admit this to itself, the slow existential crisis that would culminate in the reforms of the late decade. For an English-speaking boy in an Afrikaner-dominated school system, for a boy who was small for his age and visibly different in temperament, he read constantly, corrected adults who said things that were factually incorrect, and had not yet developed the social software that tells a person when to keep genuinely superior knowledge to themselves. The social environment was not merely unfriendly but actively predatory. He was bullied with a consistency and a physical intensity that, by his own account, was serious enough to require medical attention on multiple occasions. He was pushed down a flight of stairs at one point. He was, in the brutal taxonomy of adolescent social hierarchy, the boy at the bottom. What is striking, in retrospect, is not that Musk was bullied. Many children with his combination of traits have been bullied, but what he did with it. He did not soften. He did not develop the camouflage behaviors that most intellectually exceptional children eventually adopt, the learned self-deprecation, the strategic dimming. He retreated instead into an inner life of almost frightening intensity, spending hours alone with books, with computers. He received his first computer, a Commodore VIC-20, around age 10, and taught himself to program within days, and with the kind of extended solitary thinking that his mother recognized as unusual even by the standards of bright children. By 12, he had written and sold a simple video game called Blastar to a computing magazine for approximately $500. The game was, technically, unremarkable. What it represented was something else: the discovery for the first time that the skills he had spent years developing in isolation, the ability to construct logical systems, to hold complex structures in his mind, to work through problems with a patience that other children his age could not sustain, had economic value in the world outside Pretoria's school hallways. The Haldeman inheritance was doing its work. Not through conscious transmission but through structural resonance. The technocratic seed that Joshua Haldeman had planted in the family's self-conception had found in Elon its most capable host. The idea that technical knowledge was not merely useful, but morally superior to political maneuvering. That the engineer who builds a working system is doing something more honest and more valuable than the politician who administers a broken one. This was not, for Musk, an ideology he adopted. It was a worldview he arrived at independently, and found with enormous relief that his family's history confirmed. He was not wrong to think differently. He came from people who thought differently. The institutions that rejected him were not measuring him correctly. They were, in the Haldeman framework, simply the wrong kind of institutions. Mae Musk watched her son during these years with a mixture of pride and concern that she has described in terms that are precise and unsentimental, as befits a woman who has always been more interested in accuracy than in comfort. She saw his brilliance clearly, and without the distorting lens of parental anxiety that can turn a child's eccentricity into either pathology or myth. She also saw the cost. The isolation was real. The difficulty in reading other people's emotional states, what Musk himself has described in terms that have led to considerable public discussion of neurodivergence, was real. There were conversations she attempted and could not quite complete, moments where she reached for her son and found not hostility but a kind of opacity, a mind so thoroughly organized around the manipulation of abstract systems that the unstructured exchange of human feeling did not come naturally to it. But she also saw something that worried her in a different direction. The way the isolation and the bullying, rather than humbling him, seemed to be calcifying into something harder and more permanent. Errol's household, for all its technical emphasis, was not providing the kind of emotional modeling that would have softened those edges. The boy was becoming, year by year, more certain of his own judgment and less interested in the judgment of others, not out of arrogance exactly, but out of a kind of empirical conclusion. He had tested the social environment. He had found it consistently hostile and consistently wrong about things he could verify. The rational response, in the framework his mind was building, was to weight his own assessments more heavily and external consensus less. It was 1988, and Elon Musk was 17 years old, holding a Canadian passport that his grandfather's emigration had, through a chain of circumstance, made available to him. He looked at South Africa, at the apartheid state beginning its long, violent unraveling, at the mandatory military service that would have required him to enforce a system he found both morally wrong and structurally irrational, and performed the calculation with the same cold efficiency his grandfather had applied to Canada in 1950. The Haldeman method. When the institution becomes the obstacle, exit it. He was leaving. The world he was heading toward had no idea what was coming, and neither quite yet did he, though the habits of mind that would make him the most polarizing builder of the early 21st century were already fully formed, tempered in the Pretoria Crucible and waiting, with the patience of compressed spring steel, for a large enough stage on which to release. What no one could have predicted, not May, not Errol, not the classmates who shoved him down stairwells, was that the very certainty that had made Elon Musk so difficult to reach as a son and so dangerous as an enemy to cross as a schoolboy would, when applied to industries larger and slower and more complacent than a Pretoria schoolyard, produce outcomes that would make the audacity of Joshua Haldeman's 30,000-mile flight look, by comparison, like a short trip to the shops. Chapter 2. The Errol Musk Paradox: Engineering Brilliance and Domestic Volatility. The dining room of the Musk home in Waterkloof Ridge was large enough to feel like a performance space, which, on certain evenings, it became. The table seated 12 comfortably, though on the nights that mattered, the nights that lodged themselves in Elon's memory with the particular permanence of formative injury, There were only two people in it. Elon Musk sat at the head, a man of considerable physical presence and considerable opinions, and Elon sat somewhere along the long flank of polished wood, a boy who had learned by approximately age 9 that the most dangerous thing he could do in this room was appear distracted. Errol could speak for an hour without pausing. He could construct a verbal architecture of such duration and internal consistency that the listener lost the thread of where correction had begun and where it had curdled into something else, something that did not have a clean name in the Musk household, because naming it would have required admitting it existed. Elon sat very still on those evenings. He had discovered that stillness was a form of armor, and he wore it with the discipline of a child who has conducted extensive empirical research into what works. The house itself was a statement. Waterkloof Ridge was among Pretoria's most desirable addresses in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a neighborhood of wide lots and large homes occupied by the professional class of a country that was, at the apex of its apartheid architecture, running a kind of parallel economy in which white South Africans of sufficient ambition could accumulate wealth at a rate that would have been impossible in most Western democracies. Elon Musk had accumulated it. He was, depending on the account, a millionaire by his late 20s or early 30s, an electromechanical engineer who understood infrastructure at a scale that few practitioners of his era and geography could match. He had managed the construction of large buildings and complex systems, the kind of projects that required holding hundreds of interdependent variables in working memory simultaneously and making correct decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. He was, by the evidence of his professional record, exceptionally good at this. He was also a licensed pilot, which in the South Africa of that era carried a specific social register. It signaled not merely wealth, but a relationship with risk that the merely affluent did not share. Elon Musk was a man who flew his own plane. This mattered to him, and to the people around him in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Into this household, in June of 1971, Elon Reeve Musk was born, the first child of Errol and May, and the one who would spend the longest period of his childhood in direct proximity to his father's gravitational field. Understanding what that proximity meant requires holding two things simultaneously that the mind wants to separate into before and after, into good and bad, into admiration and damage. With Elon Musk, the two came as a package. They were not sequential. They were not compartmentalized. They were delivered, often within the same evening, in the same voice, at the same table. South Africa, in the 1970s and early 1980s, was a society conducting a vast and increasingly desperate exercise in denial. The apartheid state had, by the mid-1970s, survived longer than most of its international critics had predicted. And within the white professional class, particularly among English-speaking South Africans like the Musks, this durability produced a peculiar psychological atmosphere, a prosperity that felt both real and slightly unreal, comfort purchased at a moral price that most families preferred not to calculate too precisely. Elon Musk was not, by the accounts available, a man who spent significant time on such calculations. He was oriented toward the future, toward the next project, the next acquisition, the next demonstration of capability. The political infrastructure that made his wealth possible was, to him, approximately as interesting as the electrical grid, something you relied upon without dwelling on its origins. For Elon, growing up inside this world meant inheriting its contradictions along with its comforts. He attended private school. He lived in one of Pretoria's largest private residences. He had access to books, to early computers, to the kind of material abundance that provides genuine cognitive advantages, the leisure to read widely, the exposure to complexity, the implicit message that the world of ideas was worth inhabiting. He also had a father who was, in the phrase Musk himself has used in adulthood, with a flatness of affect that is more disturbing than visible distress would be, capable of mental torture. The word choice is Elon's. He has deployed it more than once in more than one context, and he has never, to the knowledge of any interviewer who has pressed the point, walked it back. The core conflict of Elon Musk's early childhood is not, despite how it is sometimes framed, a simple story of an abusive father and a damaged son. It is something more complicated, and therefore more interesting, and therefore more consequential. Because Elon did not simply fear his father, or simply resent him. He also, by every available indication, admired him, admired the engineering competence, admired the professional boldness, admired the sheer scale of what Errol had built and managed and flown. The technical conversations between father and son were, according to accounts from people who knew the family, genuinely substantive. Errol could explain how an electrical system worked, how a structural load was distributed, how a flight path was calculated, and he did so with a precision and an engagement that was real. In these moments, Elon received something that very few children of his intellectual caliber receive from a parent: the experience of being taken seriously on technical grounds, of having his questions answered with rigor rather than condescension. And then the evening would turn, or the weekend, or the car ride home from a site visit. Errol's volatility did not announce itself with reliable warning signs, which is, in the psychological literature on households like this one, among the most damaging features of such environments. Children can adapt to consistent harshness. The nervous system finds an equilibrium. What it cannot adapt to cleanly, what produces instead a kind of permanent hypervigilance, an inability to ever fully relax the monitoring systems, is unpredictability. The good father and the punishing father arrived in the same body, in the same voice, wearing the same face. The boy who sat very still at the long dinner table was not simply afraid. He was also perpetually calibrating, running the kind of continuous environmental assessment that the mind develops when it has learned that the cost of misreading a situation is high. This calibration, this relentless reading of the room, would become one of the most recognizable features of the adult Musk, except that it would manifest paradoxically as an apparent contempt for what other people thought, a willingness to say and do things that social convention prohibited. The boy who had learned to read rooms had also concluded, somewhere in the Waterkloof Ridge dining room, that reading rooms was not the same as being governed by them. The decision Elon made, at approximately 9 or 10 years old, to move in with his father after his parents' divorce is the keyhole moment of this chapter, the single choice through which, if you hold it up to the light and angle it correctly, you can see the larger architecture of the man inside. May had initiated the divorce, a fact that suggests she had reached the limits of what she could sustain in that household. The children would, by the conventional arrangement of the time, go with their mother. Elon chose to go with his father instead, a decision that has bewildered observers ever since he began discussing it publicly, because he has also described living with Errol in terms that make the choice seem almost inexplicable. He has said in interviews that he made the decision partly out of pity because his father seemed lonely, and this is perhaps the most psychologically complex statement Musk has ever made about his childhood. Pity, not love. Not admiration. Not obligation. Pity, the emotion of someone who sees another person's need clearly and responds to it despite personal cost. A boy of 9 or 10, choosing the harder life because he felt sorry for the man who was making his life hard. The psychoanalytic reading of this decision is almost too available. The child who cannot stop trying to reach the difficult parent, the impossible project of earning approval from someone constitutionally unable to provide it consistently. And one should be careful about applying it too confidently, because Musk is not a man who has ever submitted himself to such frameworks with much patience. What can be said with confidence is this: the decision to stay with Errol was formative in ways that extended beyond the merely psychological. It was also, in the specific terms of what Elon was learning and how he was learning it, consequential. Errol's household, for all its emotional costs, was a technically saturated environment. Engineering was not an abstract interest there. It was the vocabulary of daily life. Projects were discussed at the table. Systems were explained. The assumption embedded in the household's atmosphere was that understanding how things actually worked, mechanically, structurally, electrically, was not a professional specialty but a basic requirement of an intelligent person's engagement with the world. May, watching from a distance that was partly geographical, and partly the distance that forms between people who have separated in pain, understood something about her eldest son that Errol, for all his technical acuity, did not fully grasp. She saw that Elon was not simply absorbing his father's engineering knowledge. He was doing something more complex. He was building an internal model of what kind of man he intended to become, by triangulating between what Errol was and what Errol was not. The technical mastery he would take. The emotional volatility, the need to diminish others over long dinners, the power exercised through exhaustion rather than through genuine authority. This he was cataloging with the same meticulous attention he applied to his programming manuals, not to emulate but to invert. He was constructing from his father's paradox a blueprint for its opposite. What he wanted, with a clarity that would define his entire adult trajectory, was Errol's competence without Errol's cruelty, the builder's power without the bully's need to demonstrate it by reducing the people nearest to him. Whether he succeeded in this ambition is a question that his employees, his ex-wives, and his children might answer differently than his admirers, and the tension between those answers is one that will occupy later chapters of this book at length. What belongs here, in the waterkloof ridge of the early 1980s, is simply the formation of the intention, the moment when the child decided, with a resolution, that his particular psychological architecture made unusually durable, that he would become something his father was not. It is worth noting that this is also, in its structure, a technocratic impulse. It is the impulse to look at a system that is producing bad outputs, identify the design flaw, and rebuild from first principles. Haldeman's ideology had reached, through May's bloodline and the accident of an unhappy household, its most personal possible application. Elon Musk would reverse engineer his own father. He was still at home in Pretoria when, at 12, he sold Blastar to a computing magazine. He was still there when, at 15 and 16, he began reading philosophy and physics with the focused hunger of someone assembling a personal cosmology from whatever materials came to hand. He was still there, technically, when he finished secondary school. But he had been leaving for years, psychologically, intellectually, in every dimension that preceded the physical departure. The Canadian passport, the exit plan, the clarity about South Africa's political trajectory. These were the logistics of a departure whose emotional decision had already been made, at a long dinner table, in a large house, by a very still boy who had decided that the world his father represented was not the world he intended to inhabit. In 1989, Elon Musk landed in Canada with almost nothing, a phone number for a great-uncle he had never met, and a confidence in his own judgment that the preceding decade had not diminished but had, through the particular alchemy of the Errol Musk household, transformed into something considerably more dangerous than ordinary ambition. A belief now essentially unshakable that the people in positions of authority were not necessarily the people who understood how things actually worked, and that the distance between those two categories was where everything that mattered waited to be built. What he had not yet reckoned with, and would not fully reckon with for many years, was that the man he was running from had packed himself uninvited in the luggage. Chapter 3: Resilience and the Saskatchewan Heritage. She was photographed constantly, and she learned early that the camera rewarded a specific kind of stillness, not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of a person who has decided, with complete internal clarity, exactly who she is and has nothing left to prove to the lens. May Haldeman had been modeling since her teenage years in South Africa, a fact that tends to surprise people who first encounter her as Elon Musk's mother rather than as the person she was before that designation consumed everything else. In the photographs from her early career, she is striking in the way that certain people are striking, not merely because of physical arrangement, but because of the quality of attention she directs outward, a watchfulness that the camera catches and cannot quite explain. She had grown up in a household shaped by Joshua Haldeman's restless certainty, had absorbed his belief that institutions were obstacles and frontiers were opportunities, and had translated both convictions into a life that was, by the late 1970s, balanced on a series of edges that would have destabilized a less constitutionally durable person. The edge that mattered most in the winter of 1979 was the one she was about to step off deliberately. The divorce from Errol was not a sudden decision. It was the conclusion of a process of assessment that May conducted, characteristically, with more rigor than sentiment. She had 3 children, Elon, 8 years old, and already a creature of such interior intensity that she sometimes felt she was raising not a child, but a small, complicated civilization. Kimball, 6, warmer and more socially fluent than his brother, already displaying the relational intelligence that would define his adult character, and Tosca, 4, the youngest and the one who had perhaps the least formed memory of what the household had been before the word divorce entered it. May looked at these 3 children, and at the life she had been living in Waterkloof Ridge, and performed the calculation that the Haldeman temperament demanded. She identified the system that was producing bad outputs, acknowledged that she could not redesign it from within, and exited. What she exited into was a South Africa that offered single mothers of the professional class a specific and not entirely comfortable position. The country in 1979 was in a condition of controlled crisis. The apartheid state, beginning the slow hemorrhage that would eventually prove fatal to it, while the white professional class conducted its daily business with the determined normalcy of people who have decided that the political weather is something that happens to other people. For a divorced woman in this environment, educated, professionally capable, possessed of both modeling contracts and a dietitian's credentials, the social landscape was navigable but not generous. The support structures that might have cushioned the transition were thin. The financial settlement from Errol provided some stability, but not the kind that allowed for drift. May was required, from the first weeks of her new life, to be entirely operational. There was no recovery period. There was no soft landing. There was Tuesday morning, and 3 children requiring breakfast, and a schedule of professional appointments that could not be rearranged, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has made a courageous decision, and is now required to honor it every single day without the luxury of ambivalence. She honored it. This is the first and most important thing to understand about May Musk as a formative force in Elon's life. She did not merely survive the decade following her divorce. She modeled for her children, and specifically for her eldest son, a relationship with adversity that was neither stoic denial nor dramatized suffering, but something rarer and more instructive. A practical, almost technical engagement with difficulty. A willingness to look at an unfavorable situation and ask not why this is happening but what do I do next. Joshua Haldeman had transmitted this quality to her through a combination of genetics and the specific atmosphere of a household where problems were treated as engineering challenges and self-pity was not a recognized category of response. She transmitted it in turn to Elon, not through formal instruction but through the daily demonstration of what a person looks like when they are operating at full capacity under genuine pressure. The family moved after the divorce to a smaller home, still in Pretoria, still within the geography of Elon's established life, but scaled down from the Waterkloof Ridge statement in ways that registered. For Elon, who had by this point already elected to live primarily with his father, but who maintained the kind of connection with his mother that children maintain when one parent is reliable and the other is not, the contrast between the two households was a daily education. Errol's home remained large, technically sophisticated, emotionally volatile, presided over by a man of impressive capability and unreliable warmth. May's home was smaller, materially less spectacular, and charged with a completely different quality of energy, purposeful, pressured, occasionally frantic, but organized around a principle that Errol's household did not consistently supply, the sense that the people inside it were fundamentally on each other's side. The core conflict of May's life during this period, and therefore of Elon's understanding of it, was economic rather than emotional, though the two were not separable. Modeling contracts in South Africa in the early 1980s were not trivially lucrative, and the dietitian practice required constant cultivation. May worked, by her own account, with an intensity that she did not present to her children as heroism, because she did not experience it as heroism. She experienced it as the obvious response to the situation. There were school fees and grocery bills, and the ordinary cascade of expenses that 3 children generate, and there was one adult responsible for all of it, and therefore the adult worked. Elon watched this. Kimball watched this. Tosca watched this. They watched it, not with the heightened consciousness of children who know they are receiving a lesson, but with the ambient absorption of children who are simply living inside a particular reality and internalizing its values without being aware that the internalization is occurring. What Elon internalized specifically can be read backward from the adult he became, a belief that financial independence was not a comfort, but a prerequisite for freedom, that work was not something you balanced against life, but something you pursued with a totality that other people would find excessive and that you would find simply necessary, and that the people who complained most loudly about difficult circumstances were usually the people doing the least to address them. This last conviction has made Musk, as an adult, both a genuinely demanding leader who extracts extraordinary performance from people and an occasionally cruel one who displays limited tolerance for the ordinary human need to acknowledge difficulty before resolving it. The calibration came from May. She had set the standard by living it, and the standard was high. But May was not simply a model of industriousness. She was also, and this is less often remarked upon, a model of identity coherence, of knowing who you are with enough precision that the circumstances cannot dissolve it. Her Canadian roots were not, in the Musk household, a merely administrative fact. They were a living element of family self-conception. The Haldeman story, the technocratic convictions, the extraordinary flights, the deliberate exit from Canada to South Africa, gave the family's Canadian identity a mythological quality, the sense that Canada represented not merely a nationality but a posture toward the world, frontier-minded, anti-bureaucratic, willing to move. May kept this story alive with the particular insistence of a woman who understood, at some level she may not have been fully conscious of, that it was load-bearing for her children in ways that the immediate South African context could not be. For Elon, approaching adolescence in the early 1980s, the Canadian passport was not an abstraction. It was a physical object with a specific function. It was the door. South Africa, for a boy of his temperament and his intellectual ambitions, was becoming legible as a container too small for what he intended to do, and too politically compromised for him to inhabit with clean conscience. The mandatory military service that awaited South African men, service that would have meant enforcing apartheid in its late most desperate phase, was not something Musk was willing to perform, and he has said so directly in interviews with a moral clarity that is more straightforward than many of his public positions. The Canadian passport was the technical solution to this problem, and its existence was May's gift, transmitted through her bloodline and through the deliberate maintenance of Canadian citizenship across the family's South African decades. The revealing action of this chapter occurs not in a dramatic scene, but in a quiet one, which is appropriate for a woman whose influence operated primarily through accumulation rather than through single decisive moments. Sometime in the early to mid-1980s, May was invited to attend a social event, the kind of Pretoria professional gathering that in that era served as the connective tissue of the white middle class, a dinner or a garden party where the guests were engineers, doctors, business people, the people who ran the infrastructure of a society that was beginning beneath its composed surface to shake. She brought Elon. He was, at this point, somewhere between 10 and 13, in the window of his most intense social difficulty, the years when the bullying at school was most severe, and his inability to manage the gap between his own processing speed and that of the people around him was most acute. At some point during the evening, an adult at the gathering made a statement about technology or science that was factually incorrect. Elon corrected it. Not diplomatically. Not with the hedging qualifications that social convention requires of children in the presence of adults. He corrected it with the flat, unadorned directness of someone for whom accuracy was not a value in tension with politeness, but a value that simply ranked higher. The room contracted slightly. May watched. She did not apologize for him. She did not redirect or soften. She absorbed the mild social friction without apparent distress, and later in the car, she did not tell him he should have stayed quiet. What she told him, according to the account, as it has filtered through family memory, was closer to this: that he was right, and that being right mattered, and that the people who were made uncomfortable by being corrected would need to address their own discomfort. This was not a small thing, to tell a child who was being physically bullied for precisely the qualities that had made the room contract. It was, in the vocabulary of child development, a profound act of validation, not of his social behavior exactly, but of his fundamental orientation toward truth as the primary organizing principle of engagement with the world. May was telling her son, with the authority that mothers carry in the architecture of identity, that the framework he was building was sound. The world might punish him for it. The world was, in fact, already punishing him for it. But the framework was sound. Kimball, younger and watching all of this with the particular attentiveness of a sibling who is measuring himself against his brother while also genuinely loving him, was receiving a simultaneous and slightly different version of the same education. Where Elon absorbed from May the message that accuracy and independence of judgment were non-negotiable, Kimball absorbed something complementary, that relationships were the medium through which ambition was realized, that the human capacity for connection was not a distraction from serious work but its necessary foundation. The two brothers would, in adulthood, frequently collaborate and frequently diverge along exactly these lines. Elon building systems, Kimball building communities, and the divergence is legible, in retrospect, as two different inheritances from the same mother, two different aspects of May's own character emphasized differently by two different temperaments. Tosca, the youngest, was perhaps most purely May's daughter in the dimension of creative self-determination, eventually building a career in film that reflected her mother's insistence on professional identity as a component of selfhood rather than a distraction from it. Three children, three versions of the same lesson, each calibrated to a different receiver. By the mid-1980s, May had built a life that was, by any objective measure, a genuine achievement. She was maintaining a professional career across two disciplines, raising three children without significant external support, and doing so in a country whose political situation was deteriorating in ways that made the future genuinely uncertain for families of her position. She was also, and this is perhaps the most Haldeman thing about her, already thinking about the exit. Not for herself initially, but for her children. The Canadian citizenship was a fact. What it needed to become was a route, a practical logistical pathway from Pretoria to a world where Elon's particular combination of capabilities would find a context large enough to contain them. She would eventually follow her children out of South Africa, rebuilding her career in Canada, and then in the United States, with the same matter-of-fact industriousness she had applied to every previous reconstruction, eventually becoming, in her 70s, a figure of genuine cultural prominence in her own right, modeling for major campaigns, publishing a memoir, appearing on magazine covers with the composed attention of a woman who had always known the camera had nothing on her that she hadn't already decided to give it. But in the mid-1980s, she was still in Pretoria, still working, still watching her eldest son move through his adolescence with the combination of alarm and confidence that he uniquely inspired, and still, every day, demonstrating by example the single most important thing she would ever teach him, that the correct response to an impossible situation is not to accept its terms, but to build quietly and with complete seriousness the conditions for your own departure, and then, when the door is ready, to walk through it without looking back. What she could not have known, and what no amount of Haldeman pragmatism could have prepared her for, was that the son she was releasing into the world had absorbed her lessons so completely, and combined them so thoroughly with his father's volatility and his grandfather's contempt for institutional limits, that the departure she was enabling would not end with Canada, would not end with America, would not end with anything so finite as a destination, that the boy she had taught to exit impossible systems would spend the rest of his life building ones of his own, and that the question of whether those systems would be any easier to live inside than the one they had both escaped was a question that remained, as he finally boarded the plane north, entirely and consequentially open. Chapter 4. Early Computing. The Commodore VIC-20 and the First Venture. The manual was 160 pages long. Most children who received a Commodore VIC-20 for Christmas in the early 1980s looked at the manual the way they looked at the terms and conditions of something, acknowledging its existence before setting it aside in favor of the games that came packaged with the machine, the simple diversions that the computer could provide without requiring anything effortful in return. Elon Musk read the manual in 3 days. This is not a detail he has embellished in retrospect. The timeline is consistent across multiple tellings, and the people who knew him at 10 and 11 years old in Pretoria have not disputed it. 3 days, cover to cover, the full basic programming reference that Commodore had provided on the assumption that it would take most users 6 months to work through. He read it the way he had read encyclopedias and science fiction novels, and his father's engineering references, with the concentrated hunger of someone who has identified correctly that the information inside is not supplementary but essential, that the thing in his hands is not a toy but a key, and that the door it opens is one he has been looking for without knowing its shape. The year was approximately 1983. Elon was 11, approaching 12, living primarily in Errol's house but moving between two households with the quiet efficiency of a child who has learned to be portable. Pretoria was doing what Pretoria did in those years, maintaining, with considerable effort, the surface appearance of a functioning and prosperous city while the deeper structure of the society that had built it continued its slow, irreversible deterioration. The African National Congress's armed wing was conducting sporadic operations. The government was in the early stages of the reforms that P.W. Botha would brand total strategy, an attempt to modernize apartheid's administrative apparatus without dismantling its fundamental architecture, a project roughly as coherent as renovating a condemned building by changing the wallpaper. International sanctions were tightening. The rand was weakening. In the white professional households of Waterkloof Ridge, these facts registered as a kind of background frequency, present, slightly anxious, not quite loud enough to disrupt the dinner conversation but never fully silent either. Into this atmosphere, personal computing arrived with the particular force of a technology that solves a problem the person experiencing it had not previously been able to articulate. The early 1980s were the moment when home computers crossed from hobbyist curiosity to mass-market reality, a transition driven by machines like the Commodore 64, the Apple II, and the VIC-20, the latter being Commodore's entry-level offering, cheaper and less powerful than its sibling but sufficient, more than sufficient, for a child who was willing to actually learn what the machine could do rather than simply consume what it had been preloaded with. The VIC-20 cost, in the South African market of the early 1980s, roughly what a week of professional wages represented for a mid-level white-collar worker. Elon Musk, characteristically, acquired one. Whether this was an act of educational investment or simply the reflex acquisition of a man who bought things that represented technical sophistication, the effect on Elon was immediate and total. The machine was, by the standards of what it would make possible, absurdly limited. The VIC-20 had 5 kilobytes of RAM, a number so small in contemporary terms that it requires a moment of genuine imaginative effort to grasp what it meant in practice. Programs had to be short. Every line of code had to earn its presence. There was no room for redundancy, no margin for inefficiency. The machine taught constraint as its first lesson, and constraint, it turned out, was precisely the pedagogical environment that Elon's particular mind required. He had been living since early childhood inside intellectual spaces that were too small for him, classrooms that moved at a pace set by the median student, social environments that penalized the kind of direct, high-velocity thinking he could not turn off. The VIC-20 offered something different, a space in which the constraint was technical rather than social, in which the limits were those of the machine rather than those of the people around him, and in which exceeding those limits required not the modification of his personality but the application of his intelligence. He learned BASIC first, working through the manual's exercises with an absorption that his father observed and, by the accounts available, respected without fully understanding. Errol was an engineer. He understood the value of technical competence and recognized that his son was acquiring it rapidly. What he may not have grasped, what almost no one in Elon's immediate environment grasped, was that Elon was not simply learning to program. He was discovering the first system he had ever encountered that responded to him with complete consistency, that rewarded correct thinking with correct output and punished incorrect thinking with error messages that were specific, informative, and entirely free of the arbitrary emotional weather that characterized the human systems he had been navigating since birth. The computer did not have moods. The computer did not deliver an hour of patient instruction, followed by inexplicable hostility. The computer was, in the most literal sense, logical, and for a mind that had been running on logic in an environment that frequently wasn't, the experience was something close to relief. The core conflict of this period was not, as it might appear, the technical challenge of learning to program. Elon resolved that challenge with a speed that suggests the difficulty was never really the obstacle. The true conflict was the one that had been running since he could remember. The problem of being, in Pretoria in the early 1980s, a person whose primary gift was also his primary social liability. The intelligence that made him exceptional also made him isolated. The directness that came from trusting logic over social convention had by age 11 produced a school career characterized more by bullying and exclusion than by the recognition his abilities might, in a different environment, have earned. He had the VIC-20, and he had books, and he had the long interior spaces of a mind that had learned to find its own company sufficient, not by preference but by necessity. What he did with the computer over the following months was not random exploration. It was systematic. He worked through the capabilities of BASIC methodically, then began to push against them, finding the edges of what the language could do and testing what happened when he tried to go further. He was interested specifically in games, not because games were frivolous, but because games were, in the vocabulary of a 12-year-old who had been reading science fiction since he was old enough to hold a paperback, the clearest available application of everything he cared about: physics, strategy, space, the working out of logical systems against responsive opposition. The science fiction he had consumed, Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, the Foundation series above all others, had given him a cosmological ambition that the VIC-20's 5 kilobytes could not fully contain but could at least gesture toward. He would make a space game. He would make it himself, from first principles, using the manual and his own reasoning and nothing else. And when it was done, it would work because he would not submit it until it worked. The game he produced was called Blastar. The name combined blast, as in rocket propulsion, as in explosive force, with star, the destination that had organized his imaginative life since he first encountered Asimov's galactic civilizations. The premise was straightforward. The player piloted a spacecraft and destroyed an alien vessel carrying, as the game's brief description put it, deadly hydrogen bombs and status beam machines. The gameplay was simple by the standards of commercial software. The code was not simple. Elon had written approximately 167 lines of BASIC to produce it. 167 lines squeezed into a machine with almost no memory. Every line optimized for the constraint of the hardware. Every routine designed to do exactly what was required and nothing wasteful beyond it. The game ran. The collision detection worked. The scoring system functioned correctly. It was, in miniature, a complete and operational system built by a 12-year-old from a manual and raw reasoning, with no teacher and no collaborator and no model to follow other than the internal logic of the problem itself. This is the keyhole moment. Not the game's completion, which was impressive but not unprecedented. Child prodigies had been programming since the late 1970s, and Elon was not the only 12-year-old in the world who could write working BASIC. The keyhole is what he did next. He submitted Blastar to PC and Office Technology, a South African computing magazine, with a cover letter that asked for payment. He was 12 years old. He had made a thing, assessed its market value, and asked to be compensated for it at a rate commensurate with that value. The magazine paid him approximately $500, South African Rand equivalent, a sum that represented, in the economy of a 12-year-old's life, a genuinely significant amount of money, but that represented something more important than money in the economy of Musk's developing self-conception. It represented proof of concept. Not of the game. Of the cycle. Abstract logic converted into working system, converted into commercial capital. He had run the cycle once. He now knew it was runnable. The $500 did not transform his material circumstances. Errol's household was not in need of a 12-year-old's programming income. What the money transformed was subtler and more durable. It established in Elon's internal model of the world a direct and personal relationship between intellectual output and economic recognition that bypassed every social system that had thus far failed to value him correctly. School did not reward him appropriately. The social hierarchy of Pretoria's adolescent landscape actively punished him. But the market, the impersonal, unsentimental mechanism by which people who wanted things compensated people who could produce them, had looked at what he built and paid for it without requiring that he be likable or appropriately sized for his age, or capable of navigating the unwritten rules of peer interaction that consistently defeated him. The market graded on the only curve he trusted. Does the thing work, and is it worth something to someone who needs it to work? Kimball, 3 years younger, and by this point old enough to observe his brother's activities with genuine comprehension, watched the Blastar episode with the attentiveness he brought to everything Elon did. A mixture of admiration and the slightly cautious assessment of someone who senses that his sibling is operating at a temperature that could, under the wrong conditions, become dangerous. Kimball was already, at 9, the brother who mediated, who translated Elon to other people and other people to Elon, who understood intuitively that his brother's social difficulties were not character flaws but calibration problems, that Elon was not indifferent to other people but was simply running a different operating system that required translation rather than correction. The $500 impressed Kimball. The methodology impressed him more. He would spend the next decade watching Elon apply the same methodology to progressively larger problems, and the watching would eventually produce in Kimball not a desire to replicate the methodology, but a desire to stand adjacent to it, to be the person who understood what Elon was building well enough to help build the human infrastructure around it, the relationships and the trust that Elon's particular operating system did not generate naturally. Their relationship, in the years following Blastar, deepened in the specific way that siblings deepen when one of them is doing something that the other recognizes as genuinely significant. Elon began to talk to Kimball about ideas with a directness he could not deploy with peers his own age, who received his intellectual intensity as aggression. Kimball received it as enthusiasm, and returned it with the engaged curiosity of someone who is not threatened by a faster mind, but genuinely interested in what that mind is finding. They would, in adulthood, co-found companies together, disagree publicly about politics and methodology, maintain and occasionally strain a bond that had been formed in the specific crucible of Errol's household and tempered, year by year, in the shared experience of growing up inside a family that was never quite what it appeared to be from the outside. In the months after selling Blastar, Elon continued programming. He did not spend the $500 on anything memorable. He returned to the VIC-20 and began on the next thing, then the thing after that, working with the focused momentum of someone who has discovered not just a skill but a vocation, a mode of engaging with the world that produces reliably and repeatably the outcome he requires. He was 12. He had not yet read Nietzsche, or studied physics at university, or stood in front of a room of engineers and announced that his company would put humans on Mars. But the fundamental algorithm was already written, already running, already producing its first outputs: identify a problem, reduce it to its logical components, build a system that solves it, and submit the system to the world for judgment. If the judgment is favorable, proceed. If not, debug and resubmit. Outside the window of Errol's house, Pretoria's jacaranda trees were doing what they did every October, erupting into an extravagance of purple bloom that covered the avenues like something the city had not planned and could not entirely account for, beautiful and slightly excessive and gone within weeks. Elon was not looking at the trees. He was looking at the screen, at the cursor blinking in the particular darkness of a monitor in a room where the other lights have been turned off, and he was writing the next line. What no one looking at that screen, in that room, in that city, in that year, could have known was that the $500 was not the beginning of a hobby, or even the beginning of a career, but the beginning of an appetite that $500 would briefly satisfy and then, almost immediately, make more acute. That the cycle Elon had just run for the first time was one he would spend the rest of his life running at scales that would make the Blastar transaction look like a rehearsal for a play so large that the stage to contain it had not yet been built, and would not be built by anyone other than him. Chapter 5. The Bryanston High Assault, Physicality and Vulnerability. Kimball Musk was 13 years old when he stopped recognizing his brother's face. This is not a metaphor. He has described the moment in interviews with a specificity that resists softening, the way Elon's features had been rearranged by impact into something that no longer mapped onto the face Kimball had looked at across breakfast tables and through the back windows of family cars for the entirety of his conscious life. The face was a swollen ball of flesh, in the words Kimball has actually used, the phrase sitting in the public record with the blunt precision of a medical report. Kimball stood in whatever room or corridor he had found his brother in, and the primary information his eyes returned was not injury but erasure, the temporary obliteration of a face he knew absolutely, replaced by something that was Elon in the way that a damaged document is still the document, recognizable only by context and by faith in what it had been before the damage. The staircase at Bryanston High School was concrete, as staircases in South African secondary schools of that era typically were. Utilitarian construction, built for durability rather than comfort, the kind of architecture that makes no allowances for the softening of impact. The group that threw Elon Musk down it had not arrived at this particular act without prelude. The bullying had been running for long enough that it had acquired the character of an established institution, a set of participants with defined roles, a regular schedule, a predictability that was in some ways more psychologically damaging than random violence would have been, because it meant that every morning Elon arrived at school, He arrived already knowing, with the resignation of someone reading a recurring forecast, what the day was likely to contain. He had been, by the time the staircase incident occurred, practicing a form of daily threat assessment that no adolescent should have to practice, mapping the school's geography in terms of exposure and cover, calculating which routes between classrooms minimized contact with the specific individuals who had appointed themselves the instruments of his education in the social physics of Bryanston High. That day, the calculation failed. Or rather, the calculation was made irrelevant by a group that had decided to escalate beyond the ordinary register of the harassment Elon had been managing. He was hunted. The word is not an exaggeration. It is the accurate description of a coordinated pursuit through a school building by a group of boys who had identified their target and were operating with the pack logic that adolescent cruelty occasionally achieves, in which individual moral inhibitions dissolve into the collective momentum of the group's shared permission. They caught him at the stairs. What followed was severe enough to require medical attention, and to leave structural damage to Elon's nose that would require corrective surgical intervention not once but across multiple procedures over the following decades, the body insisting, long after the mind had processed and filed and moved past the event, on keeping its own record. Bryanston, in the mid-1980s, was a suburb of Johannesburg. The Musk family had relocated from Pretoria by this point, one of several moves across the family's South African years, and it occupied a specific position in the social geography of white Johannesburg that mattered for understanding the environment Elon was navigating. This was a world of considerable material comfort and considerable cultural insularity, a community whose daily life was organized around the assumption of its own permanence, at a moment when the country's political structure was demonstrating to anyone paying attention that permanence was precisely what it lacked. The mid-1980s in South Africa were years of genuine civic violence. The ANC had declared a people's war, the government had declared states of emergency in multiple regions, and the township uprisings of 1984 and 1985 had made it impossible for even the most determined practitioner of white South African normalcy to maintain the fiction that the country's situation was merely uncomfortable rather than genuinely unstable. Inside this atmosphere, Bryanston High School functioned as its own closed system, with its own hierarchies and its own violence operating entirely independently of the political violence outside its gates. The two forms of violence did not, in the minds of the adolescents inside the school, connect. The boys who threw Elon Musk down a flight of concrete stairs were not acting on political convictions. They were acting on the logic of social dominance that secondary schools everywhere generate, and they had identified, with the unerring accuracy of the predatory adolescent for social vulnerability, the boy who was most exposed. Elon was small for his age. He was visibly different in the quality of his attention, the way he engaged with ideas rather than with people, the way he corrected adults and failed to correctly read the social warnings that more calibrated children used to navigate peer hierarchies. He had, in the taxonomy of Bryanston High School, every characteristic that the dominant social group had collectively determined to be punishable. They punished it comprehensively. The core conflict of this chapter is not the bullying itself, as devastating as the bullying was, but the question of what it produced in Elon Musk's character, and whether what it produced should be understood as damage, as adaptation, as both simultaneously, or as something more complicated than either category can contain. This is a question that Musk himself has addressed with the kind of compressed, effect-neutral directness that he brings to subjects he has clearly processed through the intellectual rather than the emotional register. He has described the experience as formative, has acknowledged the physical severity, and has drawn from it a set of conclusions about the nature of human social organization that he has applied with considerable consistency across his adult life. The conclusions are not comfortable ones. They tend in the direction of a worldview in which empathy, while perhaps a virtue in personal relationships, is a liability in the design of systems, in which the pressure to accommodate the feelings of the people around you is, in the operational context of building something important, closer to a bug than a feature. This is not an uncommon response among people who have survived sustained childhood cruelty. The psychological literature on the long-term effects of childhood bullying describes, among its sequelae, exactly this kind of adaptive hardening, the development of an internal framework that treats vulnerability as a tactical problem to be solved through capability rather than as a human condition to be met with mutual acknowledgement. The child who cannot rely on the social environment for protection learns to build protection from within, and the structure built within tends to be, by architectural necessity, more fortress than home. Fortresses are not designed for comfort. They are designed to ensure that what happened on the Bryanston staircase does not happen again, and the design requirement tends to leak into every subsequent structure the builder constructs. The revealing action of this chapter is not the assault itself, but Elon's response to it in the weeks and months that followed, a response that illuminates, with the clarity of a keyhole moment, the character structure that the Pretoria and Johannesburg years had been assembling. He did not become conciliatory. He did not develop the conflict avoidance strategies that many bullied children develop, the learned smallness, the self-erasure that attempts to remove the target by removing the self that the target is attached to. He became, instead, physically larger. He began to grow, a late adolescent growth spurt that added inches and mass to the small boy the Bryanston group had found easy to throw, and he began, with the systematic approach he brought to every problem he decided to address, to think about the physics of personal vulnerability. He started training, not with the enthusiasm of a child who has discovered a sport, but with the deliberation of someone who has conducted a root cause analysis of a system failure and is now engineering the fix. The failure had been, in the most reductive possible terms, physical. He had been unable to resist a physical assault by people larger and more numerous than himself. The fix, in its most reductive possible terms, was to become someone who could. The process by which a person becomes someone who cannot be thrown downstairs without meaningful resistance involves time and discomfort, and the repeated willingness to put oneself in situations of controlled physical difficulty. And Elon engaged with this process the way he engaged with the basic programming manual. Systematically, patiently, without complaint, and with a clarity of purpose that people who trained alongside him in later years have described as slightly unnerving. But the physical response, while real, was not the primary adaptation. The primary adaptation was cognitive, and it operated at the level of the worldview rather than the body. What Elon appears to have concluded from the Bryanston years, from the sustained experience of occupying the lowest position in a social hierarchy that punished the qualities he valued most, was a set of propositions about how the world actually operates beneath the social conventions that claim to govern it. Proposition 1. Strength determines outcome, and strength in any given context is defined by the specific leverage available in that context. At Bryanston, leverage was physical and numerical, and he had lacked both. In the context he was building toward, leverage would be intellectual and financial and institutional, and he would lack none of them. Proposition 2. The rules of the social environment are not natural laws but conventions maintained by the people who benefit from them, and conventions maintained by people who benefit from them can be ignored by anyone sufficiently willing to bear the short-term cost of ignoring them. The bullies at Bryanston operated within a set of school rules that nominally prohibited their behavior. The rules did not protect him because the rules were less real than the behavior. This was a lesson about the gap between nominal and actual authority that Musk would apply, decades later, to regulatory structures, to established industries, to governments themselves. The consistent willingness to treat official rules as constraints to be engaged with, rather than limits to be respected absolutely, always testing the distance between what the rule says and what the rule can actually enforce. Kimball, processing the aftermath of the staircase assault with the mixture of fury and helplessness that a younger sibling feels when they understand that the person they love has been seriously hurt and they could do nothing to prevent it, emerged from this period with his own set of conclusions that diverged from Elon's in ways that would define the difference between them for the rest of their lives. Where Elon concluded that vulnerability was a design problem to be engineered away, Kimball concluded that vulnerability was the condition that made human connection necessary and therefore valuable. Where Elon took from the Bryanston years a deepened skepticism about the reliability of other people as a structural input, Kimball took a deepened investment in the quality of human relationships as the thing worth building around. The two conclusions were not incompatible. They were, in fact, complementary, which is part of why the brothers worked well together when they worked together. But they produced, over time, two very different men with very different ideas about what mattered most in the process of building something new. Their bond, in the immediate aftermath of the assault, was the bond of people who have been through something together, even when the something was technically only experienced by one of them. Kimball had not been thrown down the stairs, but he had seen the face afterward, and the seeing had been its own form of harm, the harm of the witness who must carry the image without the strange dissociation that sometimes cushions the person the image belongs to. He became, in the months following, more overtly protective of Elon than he had been before, in the way that younger siblings occasionally become protective when the older one is revealed to be fallible, when the hierarchy of birth order is temporarily suspended by the more urgent hierarchy of who needs defending. Elon accepted this protection with the slightly uncomfortable gratitude of someone who has already decided that needing protection is a temporary condition he intends to make permanent, and is mildly embarrassed to require in the interim. By the time Elon completed his schooling at Pretoria Boys High, to which he had transferred away from Bryanston in the final years of his South African education, the face had healed as well as it was going to heal without surgical intervention, which it would require again and again in the decades ahead. The nose was not quite right. It would not be quite right for a long time. Each corrective procedure, a material reminder in the most intimate possible location, of the afternoon on a concrete staircase when the world had made its assessment of him in the most direct language available. He had not accepted that assessment. He had not revised his behavior to accommodate the standards by which it had been made. He had decided, with the finality of someone who has processed an experience and extracted its operational lessons and closed the file, that the environment that had produced the assessment was the problem, not the assessment's target, and that the correct response was not adjustment but exit. The Canadian passport was ready. The plan was forming. And somewhere in the architecture of conclusions that the Bryanston years had built, in the specific alloy of hardness and hunger, and injured pride and genuine brilliance that the Pretoria Crucible had forged, something else was forming too, something that the people who would eventually work for Elon Musk and his American companies would recognize immediately, though they would struggle to name it precisely. The particular quality of a man who has decided that the social contract that failed to protect him as a child is a contract he is not bound to honor as an adult, and who has the capability, and now the resources, to act on that decision at a scale that a boy on a concrete staircase could never have imagined. What he had not yet discovered, and would not discover for years, was that the fortress he had built so carefully inside himself had walls that faced in both directions, that the same structure that kept the damage out also made it very difficult, in the moments that would require it most, to let anything else in. Chapter 6. Veldskool, the paramilitary lord of the flies. The water was there. Elon could see it, a metal canteen sitting in the dust approximately 15 feet away, catching the flat white light of the South African Highveld, in the particular way that metal catches light when the person looking at it is dehydrated enough that the seeing has acquired a physical quality, a pull that operates below conscious decision-making. Between him and the canteen were boys who were older, heavier, and had already demonstrated, across the preceding hours of this exercise, that the adults supervising the camp had made a deliberate and fully considered choice to not intervene. This was the lesson. This was, in the explicit pedagogical framework of the veldskool, the point. The water belonged to whoever could hold it, and holding it was a physical proposition, and the physical proposition was not abstract or metaphorical or designed to resolve itself through negotiation. Elon was the youngest student in his class, and among the smallest, and he was standing in the dust looking at a canteen that represented, with the brutal simplicity of genuine scarcity, the difference between the next several hours being bearable or not. And he was doing what he always did when the environmental parameters were clear and the solution space was constrained. He was calculating. The veldskool, the Afrikaans word, translates roughly as field school, though the translation loses the specific freight the institution carried in South African educational culture, was not a peripheral feature of white South African adolescent life in the 1970s and 1980s. It was, in the schools that sent their students to it, considered a formative experience in the full and serious sense of that phrase. Not merely an extracurricular adventure but a deliberate intervention in the character development of young men, designed to produce specific outcomes that the classroom could not produce because the classroom, by its nature, could not withdraw the floor. The veldskool withdrew the floor. It took boys out of the environment in which adults managed consequences on their behalf, and placed them in an environment in which the consequences were managed by whoever, among the boys themselves, was most capable of managing them. The adults present were not absent, they were watching, supervising in the sense of ensuring that the violence remained within parameters that stopped short of genuine medical emergency. But they were not intervening, because intervention would have defeated the purpose. The purpose, stated in the institutional language of the veldskool tradition, was character formation through adversity, the cultivation of resilience, self-reliance, and what the tradition's practitioners called hardness, a quality that had specific meaning in the context of a South African society that had been preparing its white male youth, explicitly and deliberately, for the possibility of sustained conflict. This was the 1980s. The South African Defense Force was conducting operations in Angola. The township uprisings were intensifying. The government's total strategy doctrine, the framework that P.W. Botha's administration had developed to address what it characterized as a total communist onslaught against the South African state, had militarized the country's self-conception in ways that extended well beyond the formal military structure into the civic and educational institutions that fed it. The veldskool was not a military program technically, but it was shaped by a military logic, that the world was a competitive and potentially violent place, that softness was a liability that enemies would exploit, and that the correct response to this reality was to produce young men who had been pre-tested against genuine hardship and found adequate to it. Elon Musk arrived at this institution as, by his own description, the youngest and smallest student in his cohort, a combination that would have made him, in the veldskool's operational logic, the obvious target. The dynamics of groups of adolescent boys, placed in conditions of genuine resource scarcity and supervised non-intervention, follow patterns that the novel Golding, published in 1954, documented with such accuracy that it became the permanent cultural reference point for the phenomenon, the book that named what happens when the structures that normally distribute power and resources are removed and the boys must distribute them themselves. Musk has used the Golding reference himself, describing the veldskool as a paramilitary lord of the flies with the flat descriptive precision he brings to characterizations of his own past. Not with visible distress, not with the performative processing of trauma, but with the tone of someone reporting the specifications of a system he was placed inside and has since analyzed thoroughly. The food and water were the mechanisms. In the veldskool exercises that Musk has described, the basic resources required for physical comfort were not distributed by adults according to need or fairness. They were placed in the environment and allowed to be competed for, with the outcome determined by the same forces that determine outcomes in any environment where physical size and coalition building are the primary currencies of power. For a small young boy who had not yet experienced the growth spurt that would eventually add significant mass to his frame, and who had demonstrated, in every social environment he had previously inhabited, a consistent inability or unwillingness to build the kind of political coalitions that might have provided protection through numbers, the veldskool's resource competition was a problem with no elegant solution. The brute force solution, direct physical competition for the canteen, was not available to him on favorable terms. The coalition solution, aligning with boys who had the physical capacity to hold resources and offering something valuable enough that they would share, required exactly the social fluency that the school hallways of Pretoria and Johannesburg had repeatedly demonstrated was not his strongest capability. What remained was the solution that his particular mind was built for, the analytical solution, the careful observation of the system's actual operating logic as distinct from its nominal operating logic, the identification of the gap between what the rules said and what actually governed outcomes, and the exploitation of that gap with whatever leverage was available. He watched. In the conditions of the veldskool, watching, actually observing rather than reacting, maintaining enough internal stillness to gather information while others were simply responding to immediate stimuli, was itself a form of competitive advantage, though it was not the kind of advantage that manifested in any single dramatic episode. It manifested, instead, in the accumulation of accurate assessments, who aligned with whom, what the actual hierarchy was beneath the performed hierarchy, where the leverage points in the system resided, and what a small young boy with no physical advantage could offer that was worth exchanging for the access to resources that the physical competitors controlled. This is the keyhole moment, And it is not a single event but a process, a weeks-long iterative exercise in the application of analytical intelligence to a problem that was designed to reward physical intelligence exclusively. Musk did not win the veldskool in the way that its designers had intended for it to be won. He did not become, in those weeks, physically dominant in a group of older and larger boys. What he became was something that the veldskool's designers had not quite anticipated: a student of the system who understood its actual mechanics better than most of the system's operators, a person who had been placed in a Darwinian environment and had responded by performing a careful, unhurried analysis of what Darwinian environments actually select for, which is not, it turns out, pure physical strength, but the capacity to accurately read an environment and deploy whatever capabilities are available with maximum efficiency against its specific selection pressures. He has said in interviews that the veldskool shaped his hardcore approach to management, his tolerance for organizational stress, his willingness to impose conditions of extreme difficulty on the people who work for him, and to regard their responses to those conditions as diagnostic of their fitness for the work. This is a statement that his adult employees can verify from direct experience. The management culture at Tesla during its most difficult production periods, at SpaceX during the years when the company was 3 failed launches from bankruptcy, has been described by people who lived inside it as exactly the kind of environment the veldskool produced. A place where resources were scarce, expectations were extreme, the floor was routinely withdrawn, and individual responses to the withdrawal of the floor were treated as the primary information about a person's value to the enterprise. The people who performed under those conditions were the people Musk retained. The people who did not perform, who required the floor to be reinstated, who needed conditions to be reasonable before they could produce, were not. The veldskool's logic applied to rocket manufacturing. The veldskool's logic applied to electric vehicle production ramps. The veldskool's logic applied to the acquisition of a social media company, and the immediate, comprehensive withdrawal of its organizational floor as a test of who among the survivors was actually necessary. The question of whether this management philosophy produces optimal outcomes is one that later chapters of this book will address in considerable empirical detail. What belongs here is simply the formation of the philosophy, the specific environment in which Musk concluded, from direct personal experience, that hardness was not merely a useful quality but the primary quality, the one that separated the people worth building with from the people who were present for the comfort rather than the work. He had been placed in a system designed to be survived rather than enjoyed, and he had survived it, and the survival had taught him something that the Waterkloof Ridge dining room and the Bryanston staircase had separately been teaching him from different angles, that the world's default condition was adversity, that comfort was a temporary and unreliable state that organizations and individuals generated by exceptional effort rather than receiving as a baseline entitlement, and that the people who understood this, who had been tested against genuine scarcity and genuine threat and had continued to function, were operating at a level of reality that the people who had not been so tested had not yet accessed. Kimball did not attend the same veldskool sessions as Elon. The age difference placed them in different cohorts, but he attended comparable ones, and the brothers' conversations in the aftermath of these experiences had the specific quality of debriefs between people who have been to the same place at different times and are comparing notes on the terrain. Kimball's notes diverged from Elon's in the direction they had been diverging since the Bryanston assault, where Elon extracted from the veldskool a framework about individual performance under adversity. Kimball extracted a framework about collective survival, about the way that groups which developed genuine mutual investment outperformed groups organized purely around dominance hierarchies. Both observations were accurate. They were looking at the same data and finding different patterns, and the patterns they found would organize their adult thinking in ways that were complementary when they collaborated and divergent when they disagreed. The relationship between the brothers emerged from the veldskool years with a specific quality of tempered trust, the trust that forms between people who have observed each other under conditions of genuine difficulty and found each other adequate to it. Kimball had seen Elon navigate the veldskool's dynamics without the physical advantages that the environment appeared to demand, and the navigation had been successful enough. Elon had not broken, had not capitulated, had found his way to the resources and the sufficiency he required through means that were not the intended means but were effective means, that Kimball's assessment of his brother's capability had been recalibrated upward in ways that would persist. Elon, for his part, had observed Kimball's social intelligence operating in an environment that should have rewarded only physical intelligence, and had noted, the observation registered, as all of Elon's observations registered, as operational data, that his brother's capacity for coalition building was a capability that produced real outcomes in real conditions, even conditions as stripped down as the veldskool. He would not always know how to use this observation. But he had made it. By the time Elon completed his South African schooling, he had been educated in 3 institutions simultaneously: the formal school system, which had given him mathematics and physics and the basic programming language; the family system, which had given him the engineering ambition of his father, and the practical resilience of his mother, and the explorer-engineer mythology of his grandfather; and the informal institution of adversity itself, the Bryanston staircase, the veldskool's resource competitions, the sustained experience of occupying the bottom of social hierarchies that were organized around qualities he did not possess, which had given him something that no curriculum could have delivered and no comfortable childhood would have produced: an intimate, cellular, bone-deep knowledge of what it felt like to be the smallest person in a system designed to crush small people, and the absolute unshakable determination to never occupy that position again. He was 17, nearly 18, and the Canadian passport was in his possession, and the plan was fully formed, and the threshold was directly ahead. But the veldskool had left him with one legacy that he had not yet fully audited, a legacy that the coming decades would reveal with the slow, inexorable patience of consequences that embedded themselves too deeply to surface quickly: the near-total conflation in his operational framework of organizational health with organizational hardness, the assumption that the conditions which had forged him were the conditions that forged everyone worth forging, that the floor could always be withdrawn because the people worth keeping would always find a way to stand without it, that the veldskool model scaled, and that the only variable requiring adjustment was the size of the veld. Chapter 7. Literary Sanctuaries, the Encyclopedia and Science Fiction. He finished the Encyclopedia Britannica sometime around age 9. Both sets of it, the main encyclopedia and the companion Britannica Junior, consumed in the way that a person with a specific kind of hunger consumes food when they have been genuinely deprived of it, not gracefully or selectively but with a totality that left nothing on the plate. This is not a detail that biographers of Musk have found easy to contextualize, because the act of reading an encyclopedia cover to cover sits outside the behavioral range that most readers have personal reference points for. Children raid encyclopedias for specific information, for school projects, for the resolution of particular questions. They do not, as a general rule, read them the way Elon Musk read them, sequentially, comprehensively, with the intention of having read the entire thing, because the entire thing was the relevant unit, and partial knowledge of a system was, from the perspective of a mind organized around complete models, worse in some respects than no knowledge at all. He wanted the whole map. He read until he had it. The room where this reading happened, primarily his bedroom, in whichever configuration the Musk household occupied at a given moment of his childhood, the specific geography shifting as the family moved and reconfigured across the Pretoria years, was a sanctuary in the precise sense of the word, a space that offered protection, that operated by different rules than the space outside it, that permitted the person inside it to exist in a register of engagement that the outside world consistently punished. Outside the room, Elon's intelligence was a liability. It made him conspicuous, made him a target, made him the boy who corrected adults, and could not decode the unwritten social protocols that governed the peer environments he was required to inhabit for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, in conditions of enforced proximity to people who had identified his difference as an invitation. Inside the room, with the encyclopedia open across his knees or flat on the desk, the intelligence was not a liability but the instrument itself, the thing that turned pages into something, that converted the information encoded in the text into the internal model he was building of how everything worked and why and what the relationships between the parts were. Pretoria, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the years of Elon's most intensive childhood reading, was a city that had organized its public life around a set of certainties that were, for anyone paying close enough attention, visibly beginning to fail. The apartheid state's confidence in its own permanence, the certainty that had allowed it to construct an entire civilization on the assumption that the racial hierarchy it had legislated would continue indefinitely, was cracking along lines that its administrators preferred not to examine. International pressure was mounting. The internal resistance was metastasizing from manageable dissent into something that required military rather than merely police responses. The Soweto uprising of 1976 had demonstrated, with the blunt force of children being shot in the streets, that the state's capacity for violence was not a sufficient answer to the human need for dignity. The years that followed were years of managed crisis, the government making tactical adjustments while refusing strategic reconsideration, the white professional class conducting its daily routines with the slightly heightened normality of people who have decided that awareness of the surrounding instability is a choice they are not obliged to make. For a child of Elon's temperament, this atmosphere had a specific effect that is worth understanding carefully. He was, by his own account, and by the account of everyone who knew him in those years, a voracious consumer of information in every form available to him. He consumed the encyclopedia. He consumed popular science. He consumed mathematics. And he consumed, with an appetite that exceeded even these, science fiction, specifically the science fiction of the canonical mid-20th century masters whose work had established, by the late 1970s, a shared imaginative vocabulary for what the future might contain and what human civilization might become if it survived its own tendencies toward self-destruction. Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, Herbert. These were not for Elon entertainment in the sense that the word typically implies something supplementary to more serious engagement. They were the most serious engagement available to him, the literature that addressed, with more directness and more ambition than any other genre, the questions he found most urgent. What is civilization for? How does it fail? What does survival require? And what kind of person does the work of ensuring it? The Foundation series was the keystone. Asimov began publishing the stories that would eventually be collected into the Foundation trilogy in 1942, assembling across the following decade a narrative architecture of extraordinary ambition, a galactic civilization at its peak discovering, through the mathematics of a fictional discipline called psychohistory, that its collapse is inevitable, and that the dark age following the collapse will last 30,000 years unless a specific intervention is made, the establishment of a foundation, repository of knowledge and capability, positioned to reduce the interregnum from 30,000 years to a single millennium. The hero of this project is Hari Seldon, a mathematician who understands the trajectory of civilizational collapse with a precision that the civilization's political leadership cannot accept, because acceptance would require acknowledging what the mathematics requires, that the system is too far gone for incremental repair, that only a complete reimagining of the foundational structures can alter the outcome, and that the people capable of performing this reimagining must be willing to operate outside and against the existing institutional order. Elon Musk read this at approximately 9 or 10 years old, in Pretoria, in a room where the encyclopedia had already given him a complete if provisional map of human knowledge as it stood at the moment of the encyclopedia's publication. The encounter between that mapped knowledge and Asimov's framework for thinking about what knowledge was for, what its preservation and application meant for the trajectory of conscious life across cosmological timescales, produced something in Elon's developing worldview that was not a simple enthusiasm for space opera, but a fundamental reorganization of how he understood his own position in the narrative of human civilization. He has described this reorganization in interviews with a directness that suggests he is reporting a genuine formative experience rather than constructing a retroactive mythology. The Foundation series gave him the conceptual framework within which his own capabilities and his own ambitions became legible as something other than personal aggrandizement. If the relevant unit of analysis was not a single human life, but the trajectory of conscious life across centuries and millennia, then the question of what an individual should do with exceptional capability was not primarily a question about personal success, but a question about civilizational contribution, about where, on the map of possible futures, a given set of capabilities could be deployed to maximum effect. The core conflict of this chapter is the tension between the grandeur of this framework and the smallness, the literal physical smallness of the boy inside whom it was forming. There is something almost vertiginous about the juxtaposition. A child who is being physically bullied on the way home from school, who cannot reliably access food and water at a veldskool without threat, who has not yet achieved the growth spurt that will eventually make him physically adequate to his environment. Reading about galactic civilizations and the mathematics of historical inevitability and beginning to construct, from these materials, a self-conception in which he is not the victim of his circumstances but the protagonist of a story so much larger than his circumstances that the circumstances themselves are rendered by the change of scale almost irrelevant. The bullies at Bryanston High School are not, in the framework that Asimov provided, the relevant actors in the narrative of Elon Musk's life. They are noise. The signal is something else entirely. The question of what happens to the light of human consciousness if no one takes responsibility for ensuring that it persists. He has used the phrase, the light of consciousness, in interviews when asked about his motivations for the space program specifically, and for his broader portfolio of ventures generally. The recurring formulation that what he is attempting to do is ensure that the light of consciousness, which he regards as the most improbable and therefore most precious phenomenon in the known universe, is not extinguished by the civilizational failures that are, in his assessment, not merely possible, but statistically probable if the current single-planet configuration of human civilization is maintained indefinitely. The language is Asimovian in its scale and in its affect. The flat, analytical delivery of someone who is describing a mathematical reality rather than expressing an emotional conviction. Someone for whom the existential stakes of civilizational survival are not a source of dramatic feeling, but a source of engineering problems requiring engineering solutions. The Foundation series did not give Elon Musk the emotion. It gave him the framework within which the emotion, the genuine deep feeling about what mattered and why, could be expressed in a register that his particular psychology found more habitable than direct emotional statement. The revealing action of this chapter is a conversation, or rather the account of a conversation, filtered through time and through the particular way that formative intellectual experiences acquire the quality of origin myths when the person who experienced them becomes famous enough that everyone wants to know where they came from. Musk has described, in various interviews, the moment when he finished the Foundation series for the first time and looked up from the book and experienced something that he has characterized as a reorientation. Not an epiphany in the dramatic sense, but a recalibration of the question he was asking about his own life. The question, before Asimov, had been something like, how do I get out of Pretoria? How do I find the environment where my capabilities are rewarded rather than punished? How do I build a life that is adequate to what I think I can do? The question, after Asimov, became something both smaller and larger simultaneously. What is the most important problem I can work on, and am I working on it? This question, stated in exactly those terms, is one that Musk has returned to publicly throughout his adult career, and it functions in his decision-making with the precision of an actual decision criterion rather than a piece of rhetorical decoration. The moves from Zip2 to X.com, to PayPal to SpaceX, to Tesla to SolarCity to Neuralink, can each be read through the Asimovian lens, as successive answers to the question of what the most important problem available to him is and whether he is currently working on it. Each transition involves abandoning a successful position in favor of a more fundamental challenge, a pattern that makes no sense in the framework of conventional career logic, but makes complete sense in the framework of someone who read Asimov at 9 and concluded that the relevant metric for evaluating any given activity was its contribution to the civilizational project rather than its contribution to the personal portfolio. Kimball, who read some of the same books in the same years, arrived at a different relationship with the material, one that would prove consequential for understanding the brothers' divergence. Where Elon extracted from the science fiction canon a framework about civilizational scale and the obligations of exceptional capability, Kimball extracted a framework about human community and the conditions under which people thrive. The two frameworks are not incompatible. They are, in fact, complementary halves of a complete picture, but they produce different priorities when they collide with the operational demands of building organizations. Elon's Asimovian framework treats the human beings inside the organization as the instruments of the civilizational project. Kimball's framework treats the civilizational project as the instrument of the human beings inside it. This difference, which appears philosophical, manifests in practice as the difference between a management culture organized around mission performance and one organized around human flourishing. and the tension between these two organizational philosophies would surface across the decades in the brothers' collaborations and their disagreements in ways that illuminated each time how thoroughly the Pretoria reading years had shaped them. May, watching Elon read through his childhood and adolescence, understood something about what the books were doing that perhaps even Elon did not fully understand at the time. She had grown up with Joshua Haldeman's books in the house, the technocratic literature, the philosophical and political texts of a man who had decided that the world was organized incorrectly, and that the correct organization required the application of systematic intelligence to problems that the existing institutions were constitutionally incapable of addressing. She recognized, in Elon's consumption of the encyclopedia and the science fiction canon, the same fundamental hunger that had organized her father's intellectual life, the hunger for a framework large enough to contain the ambition for a story in which the scale of what you intended to do was not excessive but appropriate, in which the audacity was not arrogance but obligation. She did not discourage the reading. She bought the books when she could, borrowed them from libraries when she could not, and left him alone with them for the hours and weekends and school holidays that he required to do what he was doing, which was not, she understood at some level she may not have articulated, merely entertaining himself, but building the conceptual infrastructure of a life that would need very large foundations to support what was eventually going to be built on them. He emerged from the Pretoria years with a mind furnished by two libraries simultaneously. The library of how things actually work, physics, chemistry, mathematics, engineering, the factual content of the encyclopedia absorbed and cross-referenced and integrated into a working model of physical reality, and the library of what things are for, the science fiction canon's accumulated meditation on the purpose and fragility of conscious life and the obligations that exceptional capability creates. The first library made him technically formidable. The second made him, in his own understanding, obligated, not merely permitted but required to deploy the technical formidability in the service of problems commensurate with the scale of what was at stake. He was leaving South Africa with both libraries packed, and what no one could have predicted, not May, not Kimball, not the teachers and classmates who had alternately admired and tormented him, was that the boy who had read himself into a protagonist was now irreversibly going to try to live like one, and that the gap between the grandeur of the Asimovian framework and the friction of the actual world was a gap that would generate across the decades ahead both the most extraordinary achievements of the early 21st century and the most consequential collateral damage, as the protagonist discovered that civilizational narratives, unlike foundation novels, contain people rather than characters, and that people, unlike characters, do not exist to serve the arc. Chapter 8. The Apartheid Context, Political and Ethical Divergence. The concert was loud in the specific way that outdoor concerts in the mid-1980s were loud. Not the engineered, distributed loudness of modern sound systems, but something more directional and more physical. A wall of amplified sound that hit you in the chest before it reached your ears, that made the air itself seem to participate. Elon Musk stood somewhere in the crowd, a teenager among thousands of other white South Africans who had come to hear music that the government had decided, with the reliable instinct of a repressive state for identifying cultural threat, to treat with considerable suspicion. Anti-apartheid concerts in South Africa in the 1980s occupied a strange political position. They were not illegal in the precise technical sense, but they existed in the zone of official disapproval that the apartheid state maintained around any cultural event that implied, through its mere occurrence, that the moral consensus on which the government depended for its self-legitimation was less than universal. The crowd was not primarily political activists. It was primarily young people who wanted to hear music and who had concluded, with the clarity that the young sometimes achieve before the complications of adult accommodation set in, that what was happening in their country was wrong, and that being present at an event that said so was, at minimum, the decent response available to them. Elon stood in this crowd and experienced what he experienced. We do not have his direct account of the specific emotional texture of these events, because Musk is not a person who has extensively narrated his inner life in terms of feeling rather than conclusion, and drew from the experience the conclusion that he has stated directly in interviews, that the apartheid system was morally wrong, that the South African Defence Force that enforced it was an institution he was not willing to serve, and that the mandatory military service awaiting South African men of his age and demographic was not an obligation he intended to honor. The statement is clear. The reasoning behind it, and the relationship between that reasoning and the broader architecture of his political thinking, is considerably more complex than the statement suggests. And the complexity is worth following carefully because it contains, in compressed form, the political philosophy that would produce, decades later, outcomes that many of the people standing beside him at that anti-apartheid concert would find deeply contradictory. South Africa, in the mid to late 1980s, was a country conducting its final, most violent argument with itself about what it was going to become. The Rubicon speech of 1985, in which P.W. Botha promised reforms and delivered defiance, had accelerated the international financial community's withdrawal from the country with a speed that the government had not anticipated, precipitating a debt crisis that made the economic unsustainability of the apartheid project impossible to ignore even for its most committed defenders. The state of emergency declared in 1985 and extended in 1986 gave security forces powers that they exercised with a comprehensiveness that produced internationally the kind of documentary evidence, photographs, news footage, testimony, that made the maintenance of any position of moral neutrality about the South African government increasingly difficult for any institution or individual with access to the information. The United States Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, overriding President Reagan's veto in a bipartisan rebuke that signaled the shifting of international consensus toward a position that the South African government could no longer negotiate around. For a white South African teenager of Elon's demographic, English-speaking professional class, educated in private schools, possessed of a Canadian passport that represented the legally available alternative to the identity the South African state was trying to conscript him into defending, the political situation presented itself not as an abstraction but as a personal and immediate demand. The South African Defence Force was not a hypothetical. It was an institution that would, within a defined number of years from his graduation, require him to present himself for service, to put on a uniform, and take up a weapon in defense of a system whose moral foundations he had assessed and found inadequate. The assessment was not, by Elon's own account, primarily emotional. It was the kind of assessment he applied to everything: a systems analysis, a root cause examination of what the apartheid state actually was and what its maintenance actually required, and whether the outputs it produced were outputs a rational person could endorse. The outputs were not endorsable. The system was not one he was willing to maintain. The conclusion followed with the logical inevitability of a basic program running correctly: exit. The core conflict of this chapter is more subtle than simple moral clarity, however, and it requires honesty about what Elon Musk's relationship with apartheid South Africa actually was, which is to say, the relationship of a person who benefited comprehensively from a system he opposed morally, and who resolved this contradiction not through activism or confrontation, but through departure, through the exercise of a privilege: the Canadian passport, the financial resources to relocate, the educational credentials that made him viable in an international context, that the system's primary victims did not possess, and that the system itself had helped to generate for him. He did not march. He did not organize. He did not put his body between the state and its victims in the way that the people who bore the actual cost of apartheid had no choice but to exist within it. He left. And he left in a manner that was, in its fundamental structure, the Haldeman method: when the institution becomes the obstacle, exit it, use the resources you have accumulated within it to fund your departure, and build something better elsewhere. This is not a criticism disguised as analysis. It is an accurate description of the choice available to him and the choice he made, and it matters for understanding the political philosophy that the adult Musk would develop and deploy because it establishes at its foundation a consistent pattern. The response to institutional moral failure is individual exit rather than collective reform, personal capability deployment rather than systemic engagement, the construction of alternative structures rather than the correction of existing ones. This pattern: exit over reform, build new rather than fix old, treat institutions as constraints to be circumvented by people with sufficient capability rather than as commons to be maintained by people with shared obligation, is the pattern that would produce SpaceX as an alternative to NASA's sclerosis, Tesla as an alternative to Detroit's inertia, and eventually the acquisition of Twitter as an alternative to what Musk characterized as institutional capture of the public discourse. The apartheid exit is the first instance of this pattern at civilizational scale available to Elon personally, and the fact that the exit was morally justified in that instance does not resolve the question of whether the pattern itself, applied universally and without the mitigating factor of the original institution's obvious moral bankruptcy, produces outcomes that are consistently beneficial. The revealing action of this chapter is a decision rather than a single event. The decision to prioritize departure over engagement at precisely the moment when South Africa's political situation was becoming most volatile and therefore, from one perspective, most in need of the participation of its most capable citizens in whatever transition was coming. Nelson Mandela would be released from Victor Verster prison in February 1990, less than 2 years after Elon left South Africa. The negotiations that would eventually produce the democratic elections of 1994 were already, in the late 1980s, beginning their uncertain gestation. The country that Elon was leaving was not a static system in terminal decline, but a dynamic one in the opening stages of a transformation that would require and would receive the participation of South Africans of every background in the difficult, non-linear work of building something new from the ruins of something wrong. He did not stay for this. The Canadian passport, the university application, the plan that May had been quietly scaffolding for years, all pointed north and west, away from the African continent, and toward the technological frontier that Asimov's foundation had told him was where the civilizationally important work waited. His peers at Pretoria Boys High, the school to which he had transferred in his final South African years, have described him in the terms that recur across every account of Elon in his adolescence: intense, isolated, brilliant, difficult to reach, possessed of opinions stated with a directness that most people found either impressive or off-putting, depending on their tolerance for the unhedged delivery of assessments they had not solicited. Some have described him as dark, not in the sense of depressive affect, though the years of bullying had clearly taken a psychological toll, but in the sense of seriousness, of a quality of engagement with the world that did not make room for the lightness that adolescence normally provides as a buffer against the weight of everything. He was not, by the available accounts, having fun at Pretoria Boys High. He was enduring it, working through it, applying to it the same utilitarian assessment he applied to every system he could not immediately exit. What does this environment require from me to get through it? And what can I extract from it that is worth extracting, and when is it over? May, in this period, was the figure who held the connection between who Elon was in South Africa and who he was going to be allowed to become when he left it. She had been tracking the trajectories since the divorce, watching her eldest son accumulate the injuries and the capabilities and the convictions that the South African years were producing, and she had been, with the practical intelligence that defined her engagement with every problem, building the exit infrastructure in parallel. The Canadian citizenship was maintained. The family connections in Canada were kept alive. The possibility of the departure was kept open, not as a fantasy but as a plan with components and a timeline, and the kind of logistical specificity that distinguishes intention from wish. When Elon expressed in his mid-teens the intention to leave South Africa for North America, he was not announcing a new decision to a family that would need to adjust. He was confirming a trajectory that May had been quietly preparing for years, understanding before Elon had fully articulated it himself that South Africa could not contain what he was going to try to do, and that attempting to contain it there, in the specific political and social environment of late apartheid, with its mandatory military service and its narrowing economic horizons and its violence, both the state's violence and the more intimate violence that had been directed at Elon personally throughout his school years, would not merely waste the capability, but damage it in ways she was not willing to accept. The relationship between May and Elon in this period was settling into the form it would maintain for the rest of their lives. She was not managing him, not directing him, not imposing a structure that he would eventually have to break free of. She was making possible, with the specific competencies she possessed, the organizational intelligence, the practical problem-solving, the maintenance of the legal and logistical infrastructure of a multinational family life, the conditions under which he could do what he was already internally organized to do. She was the enabling environment. He was the thing being enabled. The arrangement would persist in various forms across the decades, May eventually becoming a visible and prominent figure in Elon's public life, appearing at events, speaking in interviews, publishing her memoir with the composed candor of a woman who had earned the right to tell her own story on her own terms. But the structural relationship was established here, in the late 1980s, in the quiet work of making sure that when her son was ready to leave, there was somewhere for him to go. What neither of them could have fully mapped, in the late 1980s, was the way the apartheid context would follow Elon out of South Africa, not as guilt, which is not a register he appears to operate in with particular frequency, but as a set of formative experiences and assumptions that would surface decades later, in contexts that would confuse and disturb observers who lacked the biographical key to decode them. The man who would, in 2022, describe himself as a free speech absolutist, and position his acquisition of Twitter as a liberation of suppressed voices had been formed in part in a country where the government suppressed voices with the systematic thoroughness of an institution that understood correctly that its power depended on controlling the discourse. The man who would express deep skepticism about institutional authority in all its forms had watched from the privileged interior of white South African professional life, an institutional authority whose corruption was total and whose violence was casual, and whose eventual defeat came not from reform, but from the accumulation of pressure applied from outside. These experiences did not produce a simple political philosophy. They produced a complex one that contained genuine commitments to individual liberty, alongside a troubling indifference to the collective structures that make liberty distributable, rather than merely available to those with Canadian passports. He boarded the plane in 1989, carrying all of this, the moral clarity about what he was leaving, and the moral complexity about how he had been positioned within it, the conviction that systems organized around wrong premises should be exited rather than reformed, the specific blend of genuine principle and self-serving logic that most ethical positions contain, and that the apartheid context had given him ample material to develop. He was going to Canada first, then to America, then, in the Asimovian framework that had organized his ambitions since he was 9 years old, reading about Hari Seldon's foundation, to wherever the most important problems were waiting to be solved by someone with the right combination of capability and will, and comprehensive indifference to the consensus of people who had decided prematurely and without sufficient analysis that certain things could not be done. What the plane was carrying north, and what no customs declaration could have captured, was the set of convictions formed in a country whose most important lesson was that the people in charge of a system are not necessarily the people who understand it, that the institutions demanding your compliance are not necessarily the institutions deserving your loyalty, and that the distance between what a society claims to be and what it actually is can be large enough to fall through, and that the fall, if you have somewhere to land, is not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything that actually matters. Chapter 9. Sibling Dynamics, the Kimball and Tosca Bond. The argument started, as arguments between the Musk children frequently did, over something that was simultaneously trivial and not trivial at all. The specific trigger has been lost to the ordinary attrition of family memory, but the structure of the argument was consistent with what everyone who knew the three children in Pretoria has described. Elon stating a position with the flat, unqualified certainty of someone who has already run the analysis and regards further discussion as essentially administrative, Kimball pushing back not with equal certainty but with the social intelligence to identify the precise load-bearing assumption in Elon's position and apply pressure there, and Tosca, younger, watching, already possessed of the narrative sensibility that would eventually make her a filmmaker, observing the exchange with the attentiveness of someone who understands that what she is watching is not merely a disagreement but a drama, a small performance of two different theories of how the world works conducted by two people who love each other with an intensity that the argument itself is partly an expression of. She would have been 7 or 8. She was already taking notes in the way that certain children take notes, not on paper, but in the deeper archive of temperament, the place where the patterns get stored and eventually retrieved as the raw material of creative work. The Musk household, in whatever configuration it occupied across the years of the three children's shared Pretoria childhood, was not a quiet place. This requires some precision. It was not loud in the way of households organized around conventional family sociability. The television running in the background, the casual traffic of people moving through shared space without particular intensity. The noise it generated was intellectual and entrepreneurial, the sound of minds operating at high temperature on problems they had decided were worth solving. Elon brought this quality most visibly, but Kimball and Tosca were not passive recipients of their eldest sibling's intellectual energy. They were participants, differently calibrated participants, operating in different registers with different emphases, but participants in a shared family culture that treated ideas as the primary currency of serious engagement and regarded the failure to have an opinion as a more significant character flaw than the failure to have a correct one. South Africa, in the early to mid-1980s, the years when the three Musk children were moving through the ages at which character is most legibly formed, was a society that was, beneath its performed stability, engaged in an extended crisis of self-conception. The apartheid state was not merely a political arrangement, it was a complete ontological framework, a way of organizing every aspect of social life around a hierarchy whose maintenance required the constant active participation of every institution within the society. Schools, churches, businesses, neighborhoods, sports clubs, concert venues, all of them were structured by and structured in turn the racial categories that the apartheid legislation had made into the organizing principle of South African life. For children growing up inside this structure, with the particular advantages and particular liabilities of the white professional class, the experience of the society was both materially comfortable, and for any child with enough intelligence and enough access to information to see it clearly, morally uncomfortable in ways that required either active denial or some form of internal reckoning. The Musk children, all three of them, were too intelligent for active denial. They had grown up in a household that valued accurate assessment over comfortable fiction, that treated the encyclopedia as a more reliable guide to reality than the official accounts of the institutions surrounding them, that had inherited from Joshua Haldeman's technocratic tradition a structural skepticism about whether the people running things had any particular claim to be believed. They could see what was around them. The question was what to do with the seeing, and the three children answered it in ways that were, characteristically, entirely distinct from each other while emerging from the same shared foundation. Elon's answer, as established in the preceding chapters, was analytical and ultimately oriented toward exit, the treatment of the apartheid context as a systems problem that he would solve by removing himself from the system and building something elsewhere that was organized around better premises. Kimball's answer was relational, an orientation toward the human beings within the situation, an interest in the quality of life that communities could build even within adverse systemic conditions, a belief that the texture of daily human experience mattered independently of the structural analysis of the system producing it. Tosca's answer was narrative, an instinctive turn toward story as the instrument for processing and communicating the complexity of a situation that resisted simple description, a filmmaker's understanding that the most important truths about a society are often most accurately conveyed not through analysis but through the accumulation of specific, particular human detail. 3 answers, 3 children, 1 household. The dynamic between them was the central social fact of Elon's South African years, in a way that is sometimes underweighted in accounts that focus on his isolation and his bullying and his interior intellectual life. He was isolated at school. He was not isolated at home. At home, there were Kimball and Tosca, and the relationships with them were the primary arena in which Elon practiced, however imperfectly, however idiosyncratically, the social and emotional capacities that the school environment punished him for lacking. The relationships were not easy, because Elon's relational style was not easy, but they were real, and they were sustained, and they produced in all 3 children a quality of mutual knowledge, an understanding of each other's capabilities and limits and characteristic patterns of thinking that would prove in the decades of professional collaboration ahead to be worth more than any formal business education. The core conflict of this chapter is less dramatic than the conflicts of the preceding chapters, and more important for being so. It is the quiet, daily conflict of 3 children with incompatible temperaments and overlapping needs negotiating the shared space of a family life that had been significantly disrupted by their parents' divorce. The disruption had scattered the household's center of gravity, Elon primarily with Errol, Kimball, and Tosca primarily with May. The geography of the split, requiring that what had been continuous family proximity becomes something more managed and deliberate. Weekend visits, school holiday arrangements, the logistical choreography of children whose parents have separated but whose love for each other has not organized itself around the new geography yet. The three children held on to each other across this reorganization with a tenacity that was, by every account, genuine and mutual and slightly fierce. The revealing action of this chapter is an enterprise, specifically the series of small commercial ventures that Elon and Kimball conducted together in their early adolescent years, the prototype collaborative pattern that would eventually produce Zip2 and the template for everything that followed. They sold things. The specifics vary across accounts. Easter eggs at some point, homemade items of various kinds, the ordinary inventory of children who have identified a market and are attempting to address it with the resources available to them. But the structure of the collaboration was consistent and revealing. Elon supplied the analytical framework, the identification of the opportunity, the systematic approach to the problem of converting available materials into commercial value. Kimball supplied the social execution, the ability to actually interact with potential customers in a way that produced sales rather than the slightly uncomfortable experience of interacting with Elon in a commercial context, which required a tolerance for directness that not all customers were prepared to bring to the purchase of Easter eggs. The division of labor was, in retrospect, almost perfectly predictive of the adult collaboration. Elon built the thing. Kimball sold it to the world, or more precisely, built the relationships within which the selling became possible. Tosca, younger and watching, was absorbing a lesson that she would eventually translate into an entirely different domain, that the Musk family's characteristic approach to any problem: identify what you want to produce, build the capability to produce it, take it to market without waiting for permission from the institutions that nominally controlled the market, was not specific to technology or to food or to any particular industry, but was a transferable methodology, a way of being in the world that could be applied to stories as readily as to software, to film as readily as to electric cars. She would carry this lesson to Canada, and then to Los Angeles, and eventually to Passionflix, the streaming platform she would found specifically to bring a genre, romance, to digital distribution in a form that the existing entertainment industry had decided was not worth the investment. The founder culture that Pretoria had installed in all three of them did not express itself identically. It expressed itself as a shared underlying conviction that the existing provision of whatever you cared about was inadequate, that you were the person to address the inadequacy, and that waiting for someone else to solve the problem was not a serious response to it. May, the figure who held the family's center during the years of the divorce and its aftermath, was the source of this conviction, more than either of the children fully credited at the time, and more than most accounts of the Musk siblings have subsequently noted. She was, in the years when Elon and Kimball were conducting their small Pretoria commercial ventures, running her own parallel demonstration of exactly the same methodology, identifying what the market required, building the capability to supply it across two disciplines simultaneously, taking it to customers without the institutional support structures that might have cushioned the process but would also have extracted a portion of the control. She modeled the founder orientation, not as theory but as daily practice, and the three children absorbed it the way children absorb the foundational assumptions of their environment, not as lessons but as facts about how the world works, the baseline from which everything else is measured. The relationship between Elon and Kimball during these years was the most consequential of the three sibling bonds, and it was characterized by a dynamic that would persist, with variations in intensity, for the rest of their lives. Elon pulling toward the abstract, the systemic, the civilizationally scaled; Kimball pulling toward the concrete, the human, the locally nourishing. In the Pretoria years, this dynamic expressed itself primarily as the difference between the brother who wanted to discuss the implications of what Asimov's psychohistory suggested about the trajectory of human civilization, and the brother who wanted to know what they were going to eat for lunch, and whether the people eating lunch with them were having a good time. These are not, as it turns out, incompatible orientations. They are complementary ones, and the complementarity was the source of the collaboration's effectiveness. Elon needed someone who could translate his vision into something that human beings could engage with, without requiring them to first internalize the complete Asimovian cosmological framework. Kimball needed someone whose vision was large enough that translating it was worth the effort. They had found each other, as they had always found each other, in the most available possible location, the family into which they were born. Tosca's bond with Elon was different in texture from the Elon-Kimball bond, shaped by the greater age difference and by the specific position of a youngest child in a family organized around the intensity of its eldest. She has described her brother, in interviews, with a mixture of admiration and the kind of knowing assessment that sibling proximity produces and that no professional relationship can replicate. The assessment of someone who has seen the person in question at breakfast, who knows what they are like when they are wrong and will not admit it, who has watched them navigate difficulty and success and has formed, over decades of continuous observation, a view of who the person actually is that is more complete and therefore more complicated than any external account can be. She has also described the shared Pretoria years as formative in a way that she did not fully appreciate until she was far enough from them to see their shape, the way the combination of material comfort and social adversity and intellectual intensity and parental volatility and Haldeman mythology had created in all three of them a specific orientation toward the world that looked from the outside like ambition but felt from the inside more like necessity, like the simple inability to accept the existing provision of whatever you cared about as adequate to what you knew it could be. By the late 1980s, as Elon's departure from South Africa moved from plan to imminent reality, the three children were positioned at the beginning of what would become one of the more extraordinary collective trajectories in the history of entrepreneurial siblings. They did not know this yet. They knew only that Elon was leaving, that the eldest, the most intense, the one around whom the family's intellectual life had organized itself with the gravitational force of something massive and close, was going to be absent in a way he had not been absent before, that the geography of the family was about to change again, and that the question of what the three of them would be to each other across that distance was one that the distance itself would answer over time in ways none of them could predict. Kimball would follow Elon to Canada within the year, the pull of the collaboration too strong to resist from the distance of the Pretoria suburb they had grown up in together, the Easter egg ventures and the bedroom debates, and the shared inheritance of May's practical intelligence and Haldeman's frontier mythology all pointing in the same direction as Elon's Canadian passport. Tosca would follow later on her own trajectory, toward her own version of the same founding impulse. The family was scattering north and west, carrying with it a culture that Pretoria had forged, and that would prove, in the specific conditions of the North American technological frontier, to be extraordinarily well adapted to exactly the environment it was about to encounter, and carrying also, packed alongside the founder culture and the Asimovian ambitions, and the Haldeman mythology and the lessons of the veldskool and the Bryanston staircase, the unresolved tensions and the established patterns and the psychic furniture of a childhood that, however thoroughly any of them built over it in the decades ahead, would remain the foundation on which everything else was constructed, available to any biographer patient enough to look below the surface of the extraordinary adult achievements and find, still legible in the structure, the specific shape of what three children had made of each other in a house in Pretoria during the long, complicated, generative, damaged, gifted years of becoming. What none of them had yet discovered, and what the North American years would begin to reveal with the slow patience of consequences that take time to surface, was that the founder culture they were carrying had been formed in conditions of genuine adversity, and that the translation of that culture into conditions of relative abundance, into the Silicon Valley ecosystem where failure was fundable and disruption was celebrated, and the floor was never quite as far down as it had been in the veldskool dust, would require adjustments that the culture itself had not been designed to make, and that the inability to make those adjustments in certain critical moments would cost all three of them things they had not anticipated paying. Chapter 10. The Departure, Seeking the American Dream via Canada. The farmhouse in Saskatchewan was not what he had been expecting, though it is worth noting that Elon Musk, at 17 years old and newly arrived on Canadian soil with a backpack and the address of a great-uncle he had never met, had been careful not to expect anything too specific. Expectation was a form of modeling error. You built a prediction from insufficient data, committed to it emotionally, and then paid the cognitive cost of revision when reality declined to cooperate. He had not done that. He had known only that the address existed, that the great uncle existed, and that both of these facts represented the difference between arriving in a country with a destination and arriving in a country without one, and that the first condition was operationally superior to the second, regardless of what the destination turned out to contain. What it contained, in the spring and early summer of 1989, was the particular flatness of the Saskatchewan landscape, a flatness so comprehensive and so unrelenting that it constituted its own kind of drama, the drama of a horizon that extends so far in every direction that the sky becomes the dominant feature of the environment rather than its ceiling. He had grown up in Pretoria, a city of koppies and ridges and the vertical interruption of the Magaliesberg in the middle distance. This was something else entirely. He stood in it and looked at it, and performed the assessment he performed on every new environment. What are the parameters here? What does this place require? And what can be extracted from it that is worth extracting? The great uncle had land. The land required work. The work was the kind that the Saskatchewan agricultural economy generated in the late 1980s, physical, outdoor, repetitive, in the way that farming labor is repetitive, organized around the rhythms of the land rather than the rhythms of the person performing the labor. Elon Musk shoveled grain in a granary. He cut logs. He did the things that were required of someone who had arrived without money and without the established credentials that convert educational achievement into economic access, and who needed to survive the interval between arrival and the next stage of the plan with enough physical and financial integrity to execute the next stage when it became available. He did the work without the visible complaint that would have been available to someone with his background. The private schools, the Waterkloof Ridge House, the material comfort of a childhood that had been, whatever its emotional costs, materially generous. He did it because it was what the situation required, and because the situation was temporary, and because the ability to accurately distinguish between temporary conditions and permanent ones is among the most operationally useful cognitive capabilities a person can possess. And Elon possessed it with a clarity that the Saskatchewan flatness only reinforced. Canada in 1989 was not the country that the mythology of Canadian immigration had promised, which is to say that it was a real country rather than a symbolic one, with its own economic anxieties, and its own social hierarchies, and its own particular relationship with the vast and luminous idea to its south that organized the aspirations of almost everyone who came to the North American continent from somewhere else. The late 1980s were years of significant economic transition across the developed world. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution in economic organization was completing its first decade. Deregulation and privatization, and the celebrated creative destruction of industries that could not survive contact with global competition were producing, simultaneously, the conditions for the technology boom that would define the 1990s and the industrial dislocations that would produce in the communities most exposed to them the slow accumulation of grievance that would take another generation to fully surface politically. Canada was navigating its own version of this transition. The free trade agreement with the United States, having been signed the previous year in a process of sufficient political controversy that it had nearly brought down the Mulroney government, the country adjusting to the implications of deeper economic integration with the colossus on its southern border while maintaining, with the slightly anxious insistence of a smaller country adjacent to a larger one, its own distinct cultural and political identity. For Elon, Canada was never the destination. This is the foundational fact of the Canadian chapter of his life, and it matters because it shaped every decision he made during his time there with the clarity of a man who knows exactly where he is going, and is treating the current location as a waypoint rather than a terminus. The United States was the destination. It had been the destination since, approximately, the first time he encountered the literature of the American technology industry. The stories of companies built from nothing in garages and dormitories, of ideas translated into enterprises that changed the conditions of daily life for millions of people, of a culture that had organized itself around the celebration of exactly the kind of ambition that the South African environment had consistently penalized. Silicon Valley was not yet the cultural dominant it would become in the 1990s, but its mythology was already sufficiently established that a 17-year-old in Pretoria reading about the history of computing knew that the place where the important technological work was happening was not in South Africa, was not in Canada, was on the western coast of the United States in a geography that had become, for people with certain kinds of ambitions, the closest available approximation of what the Foundation had been in Asimov's galaxy, the place where the people who understood the stakes had gathered to do the work that the stakes required. The core conflict of this chapter is the gap between the destination and the current location, not merely geographically but institutionally, financially, and temporally. Elon was in Saskatchewan, shoveling grain when he needed to be in California, building something. The path between these 2 points required Canadian citizenship to be formalized, required university enrollment to provide the institutional legitimacy that would eventually support a visa application, required the accumulation of the credentials and the connections, and the track record that would make the American immigration system willing to admit someone whose primary qualification was a conviction, not yet externally validated, that he was going to do something important. The immigration system does not accept conviction as a primary qualification. It accepts degrees, employment offers, investment capital, and the formal endorsements of institutions that other institutions recognize. Elon set about acquiring these things with the systematic efficiency of someone who has identified the inputs required to produce the desired output, and is now working backward from the output to the input list. He enrolled at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, a decision that reflected both the practical necessity of Canadian university enrollment and a genuine assessment of where the best available education was accessible to him at that stage of his progress toward the American technological frontier. Queen's was not MIT. It was not Stanford. It was a good Canadian university with a serious academic culture, and crucially, a student body that included people Elon had not previously had access to. People his own age who were intellectually serious, who did not regard his level of engagement with ideas as aberrant, who had arrived at university with the same expectation that the environment would reward rather than punish the quality of their thinking. The social experience of university was not, for Elon, simply a continuation of the school experience he had endured in South Africa. It was something qualitatively different, a context in which the selection pressure had changed, in which the people around him had been filtered, however imperfectly, by intellectual seriousness, and in which the daily experience of being the most intensely engaged person in any given conversation was no longer a guaranteed outcome. He also, in this period, began to meet people who would eventually become significant in the network of relationships and collaborations and investments that his adult career would depend on. Queen's University was where he met Justine Wilson, who would become his first wife, a meeting that belongs to a later chapter in full, but whose beginning belongs here because it illustrates something important about how Elon's social intelligence operated when it was not being actively suppressed by a hostile environment. He was capable of pursuit. He was capable of the kind of sustained, deliberate effort to connect with another person that the Bryanston years might have been expected to have made impossible, and the pursuit of Justine was, by accounts from people who knew them both at the time, genuinely persistent, the effort of someone who had identified what he wanted and was applying to the problem of human connection the same systematic energy he applied to every other problem he decided was worth solving. The outcome of this pursuit would eventually produce both the most significant romantic relationship of his early adult life and, much later, a dissolution whose terms would become publicly contentious in ways that neither of them could have anticipated from the student cafeterias of Kingston, Ontario. The revealing action of this chapter is not dramatic in the way that the Bryanston staircase was dramatic or the veldskool was dramatic. It is quiet and administrative and almost comically mundane given what it was in service of. It is Elon Musk, sometime in the early 1990s, researching the specific requirements for transferring from a Canadian university to an American one, specifically to the University of Pennsylvania, and making the applications and gathering the materials and navigating the bureaucratic requirements of the American university admissions process with the patient, methodical thoroughness of someone who understands that the bureaucratic requirements are not the obstacle, but the pathway, that the forms are not indignities but instruments, and that the correct response to a system you need to pass through is not to rail against its existence but to understand its actual operating logic and satisfy its requirements efficiently and move on. He got in. He transferred. He arrived in Philadelphia with the specific combination of relief and impatience that characterizes the experience of a waypoint finally reached. Relief that the Canadian interval had accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. Impatience to get to the next stage, the stage after Pennsylvania, the stage where the actual work began. May, during the years of Elon's Canadian interval, was conducting her own parallel transition, the process of extracting herself from South Africa and rebuilding in North America that she had been preparing for years and that Elon's departure had, in a sense, initiated for the family. She followed, as did Kimball, as Tosca would eventually follow, the family's center of gravity shifting northward and westward with the patient inevitability of a migration that had been planned rather than precipitated. Her relationship with Elon across this distance was sustained by phone calls and by the regular reports she received of his progress, the university enrollment, the academic performance, which was strong, the social navigation, which was improving, the plan for the American transfer, which was advancing. She tracked these developments with the combination of genuine maternal investment and practical professional interest of a woman who had bet a significant portion of her own life's capital on the proposition that her eldest son was going to do something extraordinary, and who was watching from the distance of her own transitional geography, the early evidence accumulating in favor of the bet. Kimball's arrival in Canada, he followed Elon within approximately a year of Elon's departure from South Africa, restored the collaborative dynamic that the Pretoria years had established, and that the separation had interrupted. The two brothers, together again in the North American context, began almost immediately the process of reassessing what the new environment made possible. The Canadian and American technology industries of the early 1990s were at a specific moment of potential that was not yet fully legible to most observers. The Internet existed but had not yet become the commercial infrastructure it would become. The personal computer had achieved mass penetration but had not yet generated the application layer that would make it the organizing technology of economic life. The cellular telephone was present but not yet ubiquitous, not yet the interface through which most human beings would eventually manage most of their daily interactions with the commercial and social world. Elon and Kimball, moving through this environment with the pattern recognition capabilities of people who had read the complete history of technology available to them at the time, and who had internalized from the Asimovian framework a sense of what the civilizationally important developments tended to look like before they became obviously important, they could see it. Not in detail. Not with the specific product and market clarity that would eventually produce Zip2 and everything that followed. But in outline, in structure, in the sense of a wave building offshore that was going to be very large, and that the people who positioned themselves correctly before it became visible to the general public were going to be able to ride in ways that the people who waited for the obvious signal would not. Saskatchewan's granary was already 2 years behind him when Elon arrived in Philadelphia. The grain dust had long since washed off, and the boots he had worn for the log cutting had been replaced by the footwear appropriate to an Ivy League campus. But the Saskatchewan interval had done something that no amount of Pretoria private school education could have done. It had given him the direct, physical experience of starting at zero in a new country, of performing the most basic available labor in exchange for the most basic available subsistence, of understanding from the inside what it felt like to be without the institutional supports and social networks and established credibility that most of the people he would eventually compete with had been accumulating since birth. He had crossed the floor. He knew what the floor felt like. And the knowledge of what the floor felt like, the specific, embodied, unglamorous knowledge of a 17-year-old shoveling grain in Saskatchewan, while the plan was still just a plan, and the American frontier was still just a direction, would inform every subsequent decision he made about how hard people could work, what they could endure, and what the distance between a beginning and a destination actually required of the person making the crossing. The University of Pennsylvania was not the destination either. It was the next waypoint, and he knew it, and the knowing gave his 2 years in Philadelphia the quality of barely suppressed urgency that people who knew him there have described consistently. The sense of a person who is present in the required location, performing the required tasks with genuine competence, while also being, at some essential level, already somewhere else, already running the calculations for the next move, already oriented toward the California coast and the specific geography of American technological ambition, where everything that actually mattered, in the framework he had been building since he was 9 years old in Pretoria, was waiting to begin. What was also waiting there, though he could not have known it in the way that knowledge requires evidence rather than intuition, was the first serious test of whether the Muskian operating system, the first principles analysis, the veldskool hardness, the Asimovian civilizational ambition, the Haldeman distrust of institutional authority, the Errol-derived conviction that technical competence was the only credential that actually mattered, could translate from the interior world of a gifted, damaged, ferociously determined young man into something that the external world, in the form of investors and employees and customers and partners and regulators and competitors, could be persuaded to take seriously enough to fund and join and buy, and that the translation would require from him things that the South African years, for all their comprehensive and brutal preparation, had not quite equipped him to provide.